Before the bright lights of the Super Bowl and the billion-dollar contracts of modern stars, the National Football League had a very different face. Its beginnings were not polished or glamorous, but raw, smoky, and unpredictable. The NFL was born in a time when America itself was gripped by lawlessness. Prohibition ruled the land, speakeasies flourished, and organized crime seeped into every corner of society. Professional football, still fighting for legitimacy, was no exception. Imagine a league founded not in a boardroom or stadium, but in a small automobile showroom in Canton, Ohio. On September 17, 1920, representatives from a handful of teams crowded into Ralph Hayes' Hupp Mobile dealership. There were no marble tables, no microphones. Just cigar smoke filling the air and men perched on car fenders. Because there were not enough chairs. That smoky room gave birth to what would become the National Football League. But in those early years, it looked more like an outlaw's experiment than a professional sport. The America of the 1920s was a land of contrasts. Jazz clubs played into the night while federal agents raided basements for illegal alcohol. Gangsters like Al Capone made fortunes running bootlegging empires. And while the newspapers covered baseball as the national pastime, football was seen as a brutal, unrefined spectacle. The men who owned teams often came from taverns, racetracks, and bookmaking circles. It was common for NFL ownership to overlap with the gambling world, and that intersection gave the league its early flavor of danger. Tim Mara, founder of the New York Giants in 1925, was a bookmaker. He bought the team for a small sum and built it into one of the NFL's cornerstone franchises. Art Rooney of Pittsburgh, later famous as the patriarch of the Steelers, had strong ties to horse racing, with legends claiming a big racetrack win helped keep his team afloat. Charles Bidwell, who owned the Chicago Cardinals, was a racetrack magnate deeply connected to Capone's Chicago Underworld. And Arthur Mickey McBride, who would later establish the Cleveland Browns, controlled Continental Press, a wire service that fed crucial information to bookmakers across the country. These men were not polished businessmen from corporate offices. They were gamblers, hustlers, and survivors who saw in football both a passion and an opportunity. Their money, their risks, and sometimes their shadowy connections kept the NFL alive when it could easily have folded. In truth, the league's foundation was poured with the same grit that built Prohibition, speakeasies, and backroom deals. But it was not only the owners who brought the outlaw character to the league. The players themselves embodied it. Early football was brutal. Helmets were little more than leather caps, rules were loosely enforced, and games often turned into fistfights. Players were coal miners, steel workers, and boxers, men who were as comfortable throwing punches as they were throwing blocks. Crowds came not only to see touchdowns, but to witness toughness. Violence was entertainment, and brawls were as much a part of the show as the sport itself. Scandal was never far away. Long before the NFL became a carefully managed spectacle, it was haunted by stories of fixed games, shady refereeing, and outright cheating. The Canton Bulldogs and Massillon Tigers gambling. Scandal of 1906 set the tone even before the league existed. In 1925, the infamous Ringers game saw high school players recruited to pose as pros in a desperate attempt to sway the standings. Fans loved the drama, even when it exposed the chaos of the system. The Pottsville Maroons controversy that same year showed just how fragile order was. The Maroons were stripped of their championship under questionable circumstances, a decision that still sparks debate among historians and fans. This was the NFL's outlaw reality. Rules were written, bent, and broken on the fly. Justice was inconsistent. Survival meant improvisation. Yet amid the chaos, heroes emerged. Fritz Pollard, a star halfback for the Akron Pros, became the first black head coach in the NFL in 1921. His achievements were groundbreaking. In an era of open hostility and prejudice, the very lawlessness of the league allowed him opportunities that more structured institutions might have denied. Pollard's story is proof that even in the outlaw years, greatness could rise from the turmoil. This was an NFL where gamblers sat in owners' boxes, where mob money stabilized struggling franchises, and where games could look more like street fights than organized sport. And yet, fans kept coming. They loved the raw spectacle, the uncertainty, and the feeling that anything could happen. Football was a reflection of America in transition. Violent, risky, sometimes corrupt, but always compelling. The outlaw years of the NFL are not just a footnote in history. They are the foundation on which the modern league was built. Without the gamblers, the brawlers, and the hustlers, professional football might have disappeared into obscurity. Instead, those chaotic beginnings created the resilience, toughness, and grit that define the NFL's identity even today. So when we watch today's NFL, polished under bright lights and broadcast to millions, it is worth remembering where it all started. The league's DNA comes not from corporate boardrooms, but from smoky backrooms, racetracks, and coal-stained fields. The NFL was forged in the chaos of America's outlaw years, and that story is as wild, dramatic, and inspiring as the game itself. Because before there were Super Bowls, dynasties, and billion-dollar deals, there were bootleggers, brawlers, gamblers, and survivors. And it was their world that gave rise to the greatest sports league in America. And it was their world that gave rise to the greatest sports league in America. This is where the NFL we know today was born, in an era of chaos, grit, and survival. To understand the league's polished stadiums, billion-dollar TV deals, and international reach, we have to go back to a time when it was nothing more than a gamble, a dangerous dream. Held together by steel mill workers, coal miners, ex-soldiers, and even a few men with checkered pasts. These were not polished athletes on multi-million-dollar contracts. They were tough men, many fresh from the trenches of World War I. Many looking for a way out of back-breaking labor, and some just hoping to channel their aggression into something that paid a little more than a factory shift. The outlaw years of the NFL describe a period when the league was still trying to figure out what it was, who it belonged to, and whether it even had a future. From 1920 through the 1930s, football was far from the national pastime it would later become. It was seen as a brutal curiosity, overshadowed by college football, which drew the crowds and prestige. The NFL, then called the American Professional Football Association before taking its iconic name in 1922, was scrappy and desperate for survival. But survival meant taking risks. Teams popped up and disappeared within months. Owners came and went, and players often switched sides mid-season. Some franchises were tied to small towns, others to factories, and a few to men with shady business dealings. Bootleggers, gamblers, and hustlers found their way into the sport not because they loved football, but because they saw opportunity, and the players themselves. Many lived paycheck to paycheck, playing for small sums of cash handed out after the game, sometimes even in envelopes filled with bootleg alcohol or small-town sponsorship bribes. This era wasn't polished. It was raw, gritty, and dangerously uncertain. Yet without it, the NFL never would have evolved into the powerhouse it is today. These outlaw years were a testing ground, a place where toughness mattered more than rules were brawls. Sometimes overshadowed touchdowns, and where the men who kept the game alive didn't. Yet no, they were building the foundation of a billion-dollar empire. In this documentary, we'll walk through that wild history in full detail. We'll revisit the founding of the league in 1920, when a group of team owners met inside a car dealership in Canton, Ohio, and created what would eventually become the NFL. We'll explore the shady connections that sometimes linked teams to bootleggers and organized crime during the Prohibition years, when alcohol was outlawed, but illegal profits were flowing. We'll look at the physicality of the game, brutal, bloody, and often lacking consistent rules where players fought not just to win, but to literally survive. We'll also spotlight the colorful personalities who kept the league alive. Men like Jim Thorpe, the Olympic hero who became the NFL's first superstar despite the chaos around him. Owners like George Halas, who worked tirelessly to transform a rough sport into a business empire. Teams like the Green Bay Packers, who survived on community ownership while others folded into history. And yes, we all talk about the less polished figures, the hustlers and hard men who gave the game its outlaw reputation in those early decades. But it's important to remember, this isn't a story of corruption or crime winning out. This is the story of how football grew stronger through adversity. Every fistfight, every failed franchise, every shady payout or bootlegger's handshake played a role in shaping the NFL. By embracing the chaos, the league built resilience. By surviving the outlaw years, it laid the foundation for everything that followed: television, the Super Bowl, fantasy football, and the modern global brand. We'll begin with the founding of the league itself, tracing its roots back to 1920, when it wasn't even called the NFL yet. We'll look at how professional football was considered almost shameful compared to the college game, and how the first team owners had to convince local communities that this was something worth watching. From there, we'll dive into the culture of Prohibition America. Bootleggers were not just on the sidelines, but sometimes in the locker rooms, financing teams or influencing outcomes. Gambling, too, was never far away. The league had to constantly battle suspicions of rigged games, even as it fought for legitimacy. We'll then step into the rough style of play itself. These were not padded, heavily protected athletes. Helmets were leather, shoulder pads were thin, and medical attention was minimal. Injuries were constant. Concussions, broken bones, and even fatalities occurred on the field. And yet players returned week after week, because they needed the paycheck or simply because they loved the game. Next, we'll bring the spotlight to the characters. Jim Thorpe, with his fame and charisma, helped the league gain early recognition, even if the NFL itself struggled to match the popularity of college football. George Halas, a former player turned legendary owner, showed that stability and vision could transform a franchise into something bigger. Curly Lambeau in Green Bay pioneered the idea of community-backed football, ensuring the Packers didn't just survive, but thrive. And while these men became heroes, the stories of lesser-known figures, players who worked in steel mills by day and bruised bodies by night, will remind us of the sacrifices that made the NFL possible. We'll also explore the broader culture of the 1920s and 1930s, where America itself was going through rapid change. The Roaring Twenties brought prosperity, prohibition, and rebellion. The Great Depression brought hardship and hunger. Through it all, football mirrored society raw, uncertain, and fighting for survival. Fans didn't just see a game on the field. They saw their own struggles reflected in the toughness of the players. Finally, we'll trace how the NFL began pulling itself out of the outlaw years. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, rules became stricter, teams became more stable, and stars like Sammy Baugh began to redefine what football could be. Television would soon change everything, but it was only possible because the league endured the brawls, the chaos, and the uncertainty of its outlaw era. This documentary will cover it all: the founding of the league in 1920 and its survival against all odds. The influence of prohibition and organized crime on early football. The brutal, lawless style of play that shaped the sport's identity. The legendary figures who carried the game through its roughest years. The connection between America's own struggles and the NFL's rise. The transformation from chaos to credibility, setting the stage for modern football. By the end of this journey, you'll see the NFL in a new light. Not just as a modern sports empire, but as the survivor of an era where it could have died a dozen different deaths. These outlaw years may not always be remembered in highlight reels, but they are part of the DNA of the sport. Without them, there is no Super Bowl, no dynasties, no legends. So as we step into the story of the NFL's outlaw years, keep this in mind. The league we celebrate today was forged in fire. In brawls, in handshakes with bootleggers, in games played on muddy fields in front of a few hundred fans. That chaos wasn't a weakness, was the crucible that gave football its toughness, its resilience, and ultimately, its greatness. This is not just the story of a league. It is the story of America in transition, of men who refused to quit, and of a sport that clawed its way from obscurity to the spotlight. And it all begins with the NFL's outlaw years. When we look back at the early 1920s, professional football was far from the polished spectacle that dominates American Sundays today. The NFL wasn't yet a household name, and in truth, it wasn't even called the NFL in its first year. Founded in 1920 as the American Professional Football Association, the league was little more than a loose collection of small-town teams, many of which were sponsored by factories, local businesses, or neighborhood clubs. Players weren't stars. They were steelworkers, coal miners, factorymen, and sometimes moonshiners trying to make a quick dollar. The atmosphere was raw, chaotic, and ungoverned. There were no billion-dollar TV contracts, no instant replay cameras, and no player unions. Games were often played on poorly kept fields, sometimes nothing more than a patch of dirt behind a factory or in a public park. Fans would crowd along the sidelines, some standing just a few feet from the action, which often spilled over into the crowd. The line between sport and street fight was thin, and more than once it disappeared entirely. This is where the term outlaw years takes its deepest root. The NFL, barely holding itself together, attracted men who were as rough as the towns they represented. Gambling interests hovered over games. Bootleggers flush with cash during Prohibition sometimes funneled money into teams. And in an age where boxing and baseball ruled the American sports landscape, football was still seen as a violent pastime for working-class roughnecks. Yet somehow, this unruly league planted the seeds of what would become America's most popular sport. One of the defining features of this early period was instability. Teams came and went with shocking regularity. In the league's first decade, more than 40 franchises either folded or relocated, creating a revolving door of clubs. A team might exist for just 1 or 2 seasons, held together by a passionate local owner or a group of community backers, before disappearing. The lack of financial stability meant rosters were fluid too, with players switching teams mid-season, often depending on who could pay them in cash after the game. The men who played weren't millionaires. They were tough, often desperate individuals. Paychecks could range from $50 to $100 per game, which was decent money compared to factory wages, but hardly enough to build a career on. Some played under assumed names to avoid losing eligibility at the collegiate level. Others took to the field after working grueling shifts, their bodies already worn down before kickoff. Injuries were commonplace, and medical care was minimal. Many played through broken bones, concussions, and deep cuts, because missing a game could mean missing rent. Violence was not just tolerated, it was expected. The game itself was still evolving, and with loose rules and inconsistent officiating, players often took justice into their own hands. Punches were thrown, cheap shots delivered, and pile-ups became opportunities for hidden elbows or kicks. Some players developed reputations as enforcers, men you didn't want to line up against unless you were prepared for a long afternoon of bruises. Yet fans loved it. In blue-collar towns where hard work and toughness defined everyday life, football mirrored the struggles of the people in the stands. The Prohibition era played a fascinating role in shaping this culture. While the federal government waged war against alcohol, speakeasies, and bootleggers thrived. Many early football players and even team backers moved in these circles, either as customers or business partners. In some cases, the same tough men who played on Sundays worked security for speakeasies during the week, or they served as muscle for bootlegging operations. The worlds of outlaw football and outlaw liquor often overlapped, creating a shared identity of defiance against authority. Gambling was another shadow looming large. While the league itself had no formal connection to gambling syndicates, Local bookmakers often circled games, taking bets in bars and back rooms. This added to the rough-and-tumble atmosphere, where accusations of point shaving or fixed games occasionally emerged. Nothing was proven at the league-wide level, but the suspicion alone reinforced the idea that professional football was something of a wild frontier. Among the league's earliest characters were men like George Halas, who would eventually rise as a pioneering figure in professional football. But in these early years, even Halas had to deal with uncertainty, recruiting players from semi-pro teams, barnstorming across the Midwest, and finding ways to keep his team financially afloat. The Chicago Bears, originally the Decatur Staleys, became one of the most stable franchises, but they were the exception. Most teams fought for survival, often leaning on local industries or colorful backers to stay alive. It's worth noting that while these years were chaotic, they also gave the NFL its unique identity. Unlike college football, which was rooted in elite institutions and academic pride, professional football was grounded in working-class grit. The crowds weren't students in ties and hats, they were steelworkers in their weekend clothes. Men and women who wanted to see action, toughness, and entertainment. This dynamic made the pro game feel more dangerous, more visceral, and ultimately more appealing to a certain slice of America that didn't feel represented by the Ivy League spectacle. The fields themselves tell a story. Mud, not grass, was often the dominant surface. Rain could turn a game into a slog of slipping, sliding, and fistfights in the muck. Uniforms were primitive wool sweaters with leather helmets that offered little real protection. Players taped up their bodies however they could, sometimes improvising padding with whatever material was available. The lack of safety standards reflected the wider cultural view. If you wanted to play, you accepted the risks. For fans, that risk was part of the attraction. Just as boxing thrived on its brutality, early football drew crowds who wanted to see collisions, not strategy. It was less about X's and O's and more about who could hit harder, last longer, and walk off the field at the end of the day. Stories circulated of players finishing games with broken noses, busted ribs, or blackened eyes, then heading straight to the bar with their teammates afterward. This rough camaraderie added to the outlaw mystique. The NFL's outlaw years were also marked by the lack of national recognition. Newspapers in big cities often ignored the league, focusing instead on baseball or boxing. Coverage of professional football was sparse, sometimes relegated to small blurbs in local papers. This left the league to exist in the shadows, relying on word of mouth and community pride to draw fans. Ironically, that underground status contributed to its appeal. It felt rebellious, like a sport for people who lived outside the spotlight. Still, even in this wild environment, the seeds of professionalism began to sprout. Owners recognized that for the league to survive, it needed stability and legitimacy. The renaming of the league to the National Football League in 1922 was one step in that direction. Rules began to standardize, and attempts were made to enforce order on the field. But change was slow, and throughout the 1920s, the outlaw spirit remained at the heart of the NFL. This was the decade when the league forged its identity, not in boardrooms or television studios, but in muddy fields and rowdy crowds. It was an era of survival, where men played for pride, for pay, and sometimes just for the sheer thrill of it. Looking back, it's almost impossible to imagine today's NFL with its billion-dollar stadiums and global reach merging from such unruly beginnings. Yet, without those rough birth years, the league would never have developed the toughness, resilience, and working-class connection that remains central to its DNA. In many ways, the outlaw years of the 1920s served as the NFL's proving ground. The league tested its endurance against poverty, instability, and skepticism. The men who played proved that there was an appetite for football outside of college campuses. And while chaos reigned in those early seasons, it was precisely that chaos that made the NFL distinct. By the end of the 1920s, the NFL wasn't yet secure, but it had survived. And in surviving, it laid the foundation for decades of growth. The next stage of the story would see the league confront new challenges, spanning beyond small towns, facing down rivals, and slowly beginning to win over a skeptical sports press. But the rough birth of the league remains one of the most fascinating and essential chapters in the NFL's journey. But the rough birth of the league remains one of the most fascinating and essential chapters in the NFL's journey. The roar of the 1920s was not just about jazz, flappers, or Wall Street surge. It was also about barrels of whiskey being hidden in barns, crates of gin smuggled across state lines, and shadowy figures making fortunes while evading the law. This was the era of Prohibition, when the United States banned alcohol nationwide, and in doing so, created one of the most lucrative black markets in history. But while newspapers shouted about speakeasies and gangsters, another story was unfolding quietly on the football field. It was a story where moonshiners, bootleggers, athletes brushed shoulders, sometimes literally, as the fledgling NFL tried to find its footing. The NFL of the 1920s and early 1930s was not the billion-dollar, polished enterprise we see today. It was scrappy, local, and often desperate for players who could draw a crowd. College stars were rare gems, and many refused to tarnish their reputations by joining what they saw as a second-rate, roughhouse league. That left openings, and those openings were often filled by tough men who lived on society's edge. Some of those men had backgrounds in boxing, others in the factories, but a surprising number had ties to the underworld of Prohibition. Why would bootleggers be linked to football? The answer is simple. Both worlds thrived on toughness, risk, and raw charisma. The Prohibition era was about survival in an America where law and order could be bent, and football mirrored that same grit. Players didn't just tackle each other on Sundays. Many were hustlers during the week, working jobs that were dangerous, unstable, or flat-out illegal. And fans loved it. In working-class towns, where breweries had shut down and alcohol flowed only in whispers, people knew who the local bootlegger was. If that same man happened to put on shoulder pads and score touchdowns on the weekend, it made him a folk hero. One of the clearest ties between Prohibition and football came from the Midwest, where small industrial towns dotted with breweries suddenly found themselves in crisis after the Volstead Act. Many former brewery workers turned to moonshining, and some also turned to football. Teams in places like Green Bay, Rock Island, and Akron often featured men who had day jobs or night jobs linked to bootlegging. These weren't Al Capone's lieutenants. They were local hustlers, running jugs out of sheds or protecting shipments from rival gangs. Still, the overlap was real. Consider the Rock Island Independents, one of the NFL's charter teams. Rock Island was a Mississippi River town with a reputation for being rowdy and lawless. It was a hotbed of smuggling, especially during Prohibition, when the river served as a natural highway for illegal liquor. Locals whispered that some of the men who suited up for the Independents were also running loads on riverboats. Nothing was written down too dangerous, but the culture of the town made it almost inevitable. Fans weren't scandalized, they admired it. To them, toughness off the field meant toughness on the field. Another example is the early Chicago Bears. Chicago was ground zero for Prohibition violence. Al Capone's empire turned the city into a war zone, with speakeasies and shootouts becoming weekly news. While no evidence suggests Capone himself ever meddled in football, his presence defined the city. Players who lived there, many of them second-generation immigrants from Irish, Italian, or Polish neighborhoods, were immersed in that environment. Some took work guarding trucks, some ran errands for speakeasies, and others simply drank with the bootleggers. George Halas's Bears were trying to bring respectability to the sport, but in the locker rooms, the line between outlaw and athlete was often blurry. Fans might wonder, did bootleggers actually bankroll teams? While the NFL never relied on mob money the way boxing did. There are stories, half legend, half truth, that suggest bootleggers sometimes acted as unofficial sponsors. A bar owner who doubled as a liquor dealer might slip money to a local semi-pro team, buying them uniforms or covering travel costs. In return, he got free advertising and protection from rival gangs. Who knew better than to mess with the football crowd? These small, shadowy investments helped the game survive in places where legitimate funding was scarce. It wasn't just money, though. The outlaw spirit of Prohibition seemed to seep into the way football was played. Early NFL games were brutal, often resembling street fights more than sport. Players threw punches in the pile, fans stormed the field, and referees struggled to maintain control. It was chaotic, violent, and thrilling, much like the bootleggers' world outside the stadium. Sports writers of the day sometimes described football players as gangsters in cleats, not because they carried guns, but because they embodied the same raw defiance of authority. And here is the fascinating twist. The NFL's survival may have been boosted by this connection to outlaw culture. While polite society dismissed football as barbaric, working-class fans saw it as their game. They didn't care about Ivy League traditions or country club respectability. They cared about grit, hustle, and toughness. Prohibition made outlaws into folk heroes, and the NFL borrowed some of that mystique. By embracing players who lived rough lives, even if those lives included bootlegging, the league built a bond with blue-collar America that college football never could. Take, for instance, the Green Bay Packers. Green Bay was a brewery town before Prohibition, and when the taps went dry, moonshine filled the gap. Fans in the stands during the 1920s weren't sipping sodas. Many had flasks tucked under their coats. The atmosphere was rowdy, noisy, and fueled by defiance of the ban. That energy spilled onto the field, where the Packers built their reputation as the toughest team in the league. Lambeau and his men weren't moonshiners, but their fans often were, and that connection created a culture of loyalty that lasts to this day. Even beyond specific towns, the imagery of the Prohibition era gave football a certain edge. Reporters compared quarterbacks to generals in a gang war, linemen to enforcers protecting turf, and runners to getaway drivers escaping through holes in the line. The metaphors were not accidental. America was obsessed with bootleggers, gangsters, and lawless chaos, and football mirrored that obsession in a way that felt thrilling rather than criminal. Of course, as the NFL grew, it sought respectability. By the 1930s, Commissioner Joe Carr and others worked hard to distance the league from anything that smelled of crime. But by then, the outlaw DNA was already part of the sport. Prohibition had taught the NFL a lesson. Being rough, rowdy, and a little dangerous wasn't a weakness. It was a selling point. Fans wanted their football players to look like they belonged in the same neighborhoods as the bootleggers because it meant they were real. Looking back today, it's easy to romanticize that connection. The truth is murky, hidden in whispers and legends, but the atmosphere of the era makes it undeniable. Prohibition didn't just change drinking habits, it helped shape football's culture. The NFL of the 1920s survived partly because it embraced men who weren't afraid to live hard lives, sometimes on both sides of the law. That outlaw aura gave football its first identity. Not polished, not respectable, but thrilling, raw, and authentic. And so, when we talk about Prohibition and football, we're not just talking about a coincidence of time. We're talking about two American obsessions, illegal liquor and violent sport, that grew side by side, feeding off each other's energy. The bootlegger and the football player were cousins in spirit, if not always in profession. Both risked everything for a shot at survival, a taste of glory, and the respect of their communities. That is the Prohibition connection. It's not a story of mob bosses owning teams, but of ordinary men living extraordinary double lives. Heroes on Sunday, hustlers on Monday. And in that mix of grit and glory, the NFL found its heartbeat. Because without that outlaw edge, without that link to America's hidden underworld, the league might never have captured the imagination of the working class. And without the working class, there might never have been an NFL at all. The NFL's story in the Prohibition era is a reminder. The game has always belonged to the people who were willing to fight for it. whether on muddy fields or in moonlit barns. And that truth carries us forward. Because the outlaw years weren't just about crime, they were about survival, identity, and the birth of a sport that would one day rule Sundays. Football in its early decades was never just about touchdowns, rushing yards, or clever plays. It was also about intimidation, toughness, and sometimes sheer physical dominance. Before there were strict penalty codes, replay reviews, and carefully written rulebooks designed to protect players, there was chaos. And in that chaos, brawlers thrived. These were men who didn't just tackle hard. They punched, elbowed, clawed, and dared anyone to push back. To understand the outlaw years of the NFL, you need to see how violence was indeed just a byproduct of the game. It was part of its DNA. Fans at the time didn't always shy away from this brutality. In fact, many came to see it. Early newspapers often described football games as slugfests or street fights in shoulder pads. The gridiron was one of the only places in America where organized violence was not just tolerated, but celebrated. And in an era where bare-knuckle boxing and saloon brawls were entertainment, football's violence fit right into the cultural fabric. Some of the earliest football teams built reputations not around skill, but around fear. If you knew you were playing against certain squads, you knew it was going to get ugly. Opponents came away with broken noses, missing teeth, and sometimes concussions that would sideline them for weeks. There were no concussion protocols, no blue tents on the sidelines, just smelling salts, maybe a bandage, and a demand to get back out there. One infamous example came from the early Chicago Bears under George Halas, known as the Monsters of the Midway long before the name stuck. Those Bear squads were brutal. They weren't just trying to beat you on the scoreboard. They wanted to dominate you physically until you quit. Punches and late hits weren't exactly written into the playbook, but they were understood as part of the job. The same was true for teams like the Green Bay Packers and the Pittsburgh Steelers, who were no strangers to gritty street-style play. Players themselves came from backgrounds where toughness wasn't optionally, was survival. Many worked in factories, steel mills, and coal mines. Some had served in World War I and brought battlefield grit back to the football field. Others had fought in alleyways or taverns long before they put on pads. For them, throwing a punch in the middle of a game wasn't unsportsmanlike. It was simply another form of competition, another way to gain an edge. It wasn't just isolated scraps. Either bench-clearing fights were common. Entire teams would rush the field, swinging at anyone in an opposing uniform. Imagine watching a modern NFL game where, after a single late hit, two full sidelines erupted into a melee. In the outlaw years, that was less of a scandal and more of an expectation. Fans didn't gasp in shock. They roared in approval. Newspapers sometimes glamorized these fights, portraying players as folk heroes who stood their ground. A lineman who threw fists to defend his teammates was often praised, not penalized. Headlines carried phrases like gridiron war, battle to the finish, and leather helmet slugfest. The line between football and boxing blurred so much that some athletes crossed into both sports. They saw no contradiction between being a football player on Sunday and a prize fighter on Monday. One legendary name who epitomized this was Bronco Nagurski. Though more famous for his bruising runs as a fullback for the Chicago Bears, Nagurski was also a professional wrestler. His image embodied raw power and intimidation. He didn't necessarily have to throw fists, but opponents knew better than to test him. The same was true for others who mixed football with wrestling or boxing men who carried reputations as legitimate tough guys, both on and off the field. But violence came with consequences. Games sometimes ended with hospital visits, stitches, or broken bones. Careers could be shortened not by legal tackles, but by illegal cheap shots. Yet, in those days, it was rarely seen as crossing a line. The culture of football rewarded resilience. If you could take a punch and keep playing, your stock went up. If you backed down, you might as well hand in your jersey. Coaches, too, often encouraged brawling. They might not have said it outright, but they made it clear. Don't let anyone push you around. In a time when the NFL was fighting for attention against college football, which was still far more popular, the professional game needed to carve out its identity. Its edge became its selling point. College football was for gentlemen. Pro football, that was for fighters. One of the more fascinating aspects of these outlaw years is how referees handled or didn't handle the violence. Unlike today's tightly controlled officiating, refs often turned a blind eye. Some were intimidated by players who towered over them. Others simply didn't want to interfere with what the crowd came to see. And let's not forget, officials were often local hires with little training. Controlling 22 men intent on smashing each other wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. In fact, the NFL wouldn't even establish strict penalty codes until later. Early rules were vague, and punishment for fighting was inconsistent at best. Sometimes a player would get ejected. Other times, he'd get a warning. And quite often, the fight would be broken up, play would resume, and the memory of flying fists was just part of the game. The absence of standardized discipline only encouraged the behavior further. As the league grew, so did the reputation of its most violent players. Fans remembered their names not just for touchdowns or interceptions, but for toughness in the trenches. Some of these men were nicknamed after their brawling reputations: Bruiser, Iron Man, Killer. These weren't just nicknames for flair, they reflected real experiences. Opponents genuinely feared lining up across from them. Even with all this violence, one important thing stands out. The brawlers weren't villains to their fans. They were protectors, enforcers, symbols of blue-collar grit. In an America reeling from the Great Depression, toughness resonated. People wanted to cheer for men who fought like their lives depended on it, because in many ways, their own lives did. A hard-hit tackle or a sideline brawl reflected the everyday struggles of working-class fans who felt they were fighting battles of their own. This outlaw culture of fists-first football began to shift as the NFL grew more mainstream. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the league realized it couldn't sustain constant violence if it wanted to reach broader audiences. Families, advertisers, and sponsors were less enthusiastic about street fights on the field. The league needed legitimacy, and to gain it, the fists had to start giving way to flags. Still, the legacy of those years hasn't disappeared. Even today, fans debate about whether the NFL has gone soft. When an old-school brawl breaks out, whether in the trenches or after a late hit, it echoes the outlaw years when violence defined the game. While today's NFL penalizes such behavior, in the past, it was the very thing that made professional football stand apart. So when we talk about the NFL's outlaw years, we cannot ignore the brawlers. They weren't an embarrassment, they were part of the foundation. Without them, the league may not have survived those fragile early decades. Their fists, as much as their feet or arms, helped carve football's identity. And while flags eventually replaced brawls, the memories of those wild, bloody Sundays remain etched in the story of America's game. And as we transition from the violence on the field to the chaos off it, the story only gets more tangled. Because if players were throwing punches between whistles, some of them were also living double lives once the final whistle blew. When you peel back the curtain on the NFL's earliest decades, what you find is not the polished billion-dollar empire that dazzles global audiences today, but a scrappy, unpredictable, and often chaotic world where the game's survival was tied directly to America's most notorious undercurrents. Behind the touchdowns and roaring crowds, there were whispers of mobsters greasing palms, bootleggers bankrolling rosters, and backroom deals where moonshine flowed as freely as cash. Football was still clawing its way into relevance, and in that climb, the sport leaned heavily on characters from America's gritty underworld. This was not a sanitized era. Stadiums weren't always filled with families. The press didn't always celebrate integrity. Instead, the league was a fragile experiment, and to survive, It embraced partnerships and patrons that mainstream society often labeled criminal. When we talk about moonshine and mobsters lurking in the shadows of the NFL, we're not exaggerating. We're painting the reality of a league that thrived in an America drenched in prohibition, speakeasies, and organized crime. Picture this. The 1920s and 1930s were roaring with rebellion. Alcohol was illegal, but drinking was everywhere. Cities pulsed with jazz, smoke-filled bars, and hidden clubs where law enforcement looked the other way. Football was trying to compete with baseball, boxing, and horse racing, and that meant finding money wherever it could. Many times, that money came from local businessmen who didn't mind breaking the law, if it meant a crowd gathered and dollars flowed. For moonshiners, football became a legitimate front. For mobsters, it was a way to flex power, curry public favor, and launder illicit gains. Teams like the Duluth, Eskimos, or early barnstorming clubs didn't have billion-dollar ownership groups or corporate sponsors. Instead, they relied on small-town promoters or city bosses. Many of those men had ties to alcohol-running operations, gambling, or unions influenced by organized crime. They saw football not just as entertainment, but as a revenue stream ticket sales, betting action, and influence over local culture. It's no coincidence that cities with heavy mob presences, like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, became hotbeds for early professional football. Chicago in particular was the beating heart of this collision between the NFL and the mob. It was a city where Al Capone ruled prohibition, controlling speakeasies, breweries, and distribution lines for illegal liquor. Chicago also birthed the Bears, one of the league's flagship franchises. Did Capone personally bankroll games? There's no smoking gun tying him directly to NFL ownership, but historians note his influence on Chicago's sports culture was enormous. He mingled with athletes, bet heavily on games, and had lieutenants who rubbed shoulders with promoters. When the Bears and Cardinals played, it wasn't just football, it was theater for a city buzzing with gangland headlines. Mobsters saw football as a cousin to boxing, a sport they already controlled through fighters, managers, and gambling networks. Fixing a game, leaning on a referee, or nudging a coach wasn't unheard of. Even if the NFL avoided the worst scandals, it lived in an ecosystem where gambling overlapped with every contest. Too many fans in smoky taverns, football's danger and unpredictability fit perfectly with the illicit thrills of speakeasy life. Watching men slug it out on the field while sipping illegal whiskey made sense in an age where nothing about entertainment was clean or regulated. Moonshine culture had its own fascinating overlap with the game. In rural areas, especially in the South and Appalachia, moonshiners used football as both community bonding and marketing. High school and small college football was often underwritten by men running stills in the woods. By the time the NFL came calling, some of those same figures found themselves supporting semi-pro and professional clubs. The gritty toughness required to haul barrels of liquor through mountain trails mirrored the toughness football demanded. It's little wonder that moonshine money sometimes found its way into player paychecks or equipment bills. What's remarkable is how football managed to absorb this shadowy backing without collapsing into scandal. Baseball had its infamous Black Sox scandal in 1919, where gambling and mob influence tainted the World Series. Boxing was openly controlled by mobsters, with champions rising or falling based on who their backers were. Yet football walked a strange line. Its reputation wasn't squeaky clean, but it wasn't fatally wounded either. Why? Partly because the sport was still small enough to fly under the radar of major national headlines. A mobster could influence a local team without drawing the fury of Washington or the public. But let's not pretend football was untouched. There are documented stories of players paid under the table with money of dubious origin. Some teams played in stadiums, built or maintained with mob ties. Rumors swirled of referees pressured by gambling interests. When games became rough, when benches cleared and fights spilled into the stands, it was on just about tempers it. Was about a culture shaped by men who settled disputes with fists and firepower off the field too. The NFL also intersected with mob-controlled unions. Stadium labor, ticket printing, concessions, all of these industries in big cities often fell under mob influence. Owning a slice of the NFL's infrastructure meant mobsters could both profit and exert quiet power. And while the league's official leadership tried to keep things clean, the reality is they didn't always have a choice. They needed venues, they needed sponsors, and they needed fans. If those things came with a whiff of smoke from a backroom deal, the NFL took it. Yet out of that gritty backstage grew resilience. Football learned early how to survive in environments where lawlessness reigned, developed a culture of toughness not just on the field, but in its business dealings. Owners, players, and coaches became skilled at navigating complex alliances. That same adaptability allowed the NFL to later court television networks, corporations, and mainstream America. In a sense, the sports survival in the outlaw years prepared it to thrive in the corporate years. Fans often ask, why don't we hear more about this connection today? The answer is simple. As the NFL rose into respectability, it buried its messy past. The league wanted to be family-friendly, a patriotic symbol, a clean competitor to baseball. Stories of mobsters or moonshiners backing teams didn't fit that narrative. But those stories remain in the archives in newspaper clippings of mob-boned bars advertising football games in whispers about gamblers, hanging around locker rooms, and in the quiet acknowledgement that without some shady help, the league might never have made it out of its infancy. What makes this chapter of NFL history so fascinating is that it mirrors America itself. The 1920s and 1930s were not clean decades. They were decades of survival, ambition, and bending rules. The NFL wasn't separate from that culture, was born inside it. Just as moonshine funded communities and mobsters shaped city politics, those same forces left fingerprints on football's rise. So when we look at the NFL's gritty backstage of moonshine and mobsters, we're not talking about shame or scandal. We're talking about a league that reflects the raw, unvarnished truth of its time. A league tough enough to survive the chaos, bold enough to lean on unlikely patrons, and strong enough to eventually rise above them. That grit became part of football's DNA, giving us a sport that could endure wars, depressions, and shifting cultures. In many ways, the polished NFL we see today multi-billion-dollar stadiums, high-tech broadcasts, global fan bases owes a quiet debt to its rough and tumble beginnings. Because without the moonshiners, without the mobsters, without that gritty backstage, the NFL might never have had the muscle to survive its earliest battles. And as we peel back those stories, it only makes the league's journey more impressive. It wasn't born clean, but it was born strong. And that strength, forged in the smoky rooms of Prohibition America, still echoes every Sunday when fans cheer, when players clash, and when the NFL proves yet again that it is bigger than the odds stacked against it. The National Football League that fans adore today with billion-dollar franchises, polished TV contracts, and squeaky clean public images was not always that way. In its infancy, the league was closer to a traveling carnival of tough men than a corporate enterprise. In fact, during the 1920s and early 1930s, the NFL often looked less like a sports league and more like a barroom brawl spilling out onto muddy fields. The fights were real, the grudges were personal, and the structure that we now take for granted had yet to solidify. To understand how far the NFL has come, it is essential to revisit this rugged chapter when football was a frontier and chaos reigned. The atmosphere of early games was something fans today would hardly recognize. There were no million-dollar sponsorships, no luxury boxes, and certainly no league office keeping strict order. Stadiums were often makeshift fields, carved out of farmland or located on the edges of industrial towns. Crowds packed in, sometimes without proper bleachers, standing shoulder to shoulder along sidelines that weren't even roped off. Beer flowed freely, fans heckled loudly, and referees had little authority to maintain peace. When a game turned rough-hand, they often did players and spectators alike. found themselves in the thick of brawls that blurred the line between sport and survival. The reputation of the league in this period was that of a working man's fight club. Players were rarely college stars with clean-cut images. Instead, they were miners, steelworkers, bartenders, and men who had just come back from World War I. These men weren't playing for glory or glamour. They played for a paycheck, sometimes as little as $5 or $10 a game. Their toughness wasn't an act. It was survival honed from real-life hardship. So, when a tackle went too far or a dirty play sparked tempers, fists flew in ways that modern fans would never see in today's carefully governed game. One of the unique features of this era was how fights became part of the entertainment. Crowds came expecting a scuffle. Fans were accustomed to rough sports like boxing and wrestling, and they carried that appetite into their football Saturdays and Sundays. When fists broke out, the spectators roared, sometimes louder than they did for touchdowns. In this way, early NFL games mirrored the barroom culture of the time, where disputes were settled with punches, not paperwork. The referees of the day faced an impossible task, with few clear-cut rules and limited authority. Officials were more like negotiators trying to keep games moving than actual enforcers of order. Players could throw a punch or level a late hit without much more than a stern warning. Suspensions were rare, fines even rarer. For players already scraping by financially, losing game time wasn't an option. They played through bruises, broken bones, and grudges, sometimes exacting revenge in the very next quarter. But the bar fight atmosphere wasn't limited to the players. Owners and managers were no strangers to physical disputes. The business side of football was equally unregulated, with teams folding overnight, switching cities, or merging on a whim. Financial disputes often turned into shouting matches, and in some cases, even fists flew off the field between men running the teams. The NFL was a league of hustlers, and survival required more grit than polish. It's important to remember that the United States in this era was already a volatile landscape. The Roaring Twenties had given rise to speakeasies, bootleggers, and a culture of rebellion against authority. The Great Depression that followed fueled even more desperation, making every dollar and every opportunity a matter of survival. Football reflected that broader social chaos. Just as bars and back rooms were filled with fistfights and deals cut in smoke-filled rooms, so too was the NFL infused with that rough-and-tumble spirit. The players themselves were often compared to barroom brawlers in the press. Newspapers of the day described games as slugfests or muddy melees, where the highlight wasn't always the score, but the sheer physical spectacle. Legendary tough men like Bronco Nagurski embodied this era. Nagurski, a farmer-turned-football star, was known for running straight through defenders like a freight train. His style wasn't about finesse, was about force. Stories circulated of him flattening entire defensive lines, and while his skill was undeniable, it was his toughness that fans idolized. There were games where benches cleared just like in baseball, and full-on teamfights took place. While the league today would levy massive fines and suspensions, back then, these incidents only fueled the legend of the sport's toughness. Players wore leather helmets. They wore helmets at a land padding was minimal. Every collision rattled bones, and every skirmish carried the potential to erupt into chaos. This environment fostered a reputation. Football wasn't a game for the faint of heart. It was war without weapons, and those who played it were hardened warriors. Another key feature of this era was the direct link between football and the tavern culture of its towns. Teams were often sponsored or supported by local bars or breweries. After games, players and fans mingled in saloons, celebrating wins or nursing defeats with pitchers of beer. The same players who threw punches on the field could be found later that night in bar fights or arm wrestling contests, cementing their reputation as both athletes and local tough guys. The line between professional football player and everyday laborer was blurred, and that authenticity drew fans. The bar fight image of the NFL also reflected how little media polish existed at the time. Radio was only just beginning to cover games, and there was no nationwide television exposure. The stories that spread were word-of-mouth accounts or local newspaper exaggerations. Fans loved recounting tales of brutal tackles or legendary brawls, often romanticizing the violence as part of the game's charm. Without national oversight, these stories grew into folklore that shaped the league's identity as a tough man's game. It's easy now to look back and see this as disorderly or even damaging to the league's reputation. But in reality, it was this very grit that gave the NFL its backbone. The players and fans of that era demanded toughness and authenticity, and the league delivered. Without those rough and rowdy beginnings, the NFL might never have built the cultural credibility that allowed it to grow into the powerhouse it is today. Fans wanted to believe their heroes were warriors, not entertainers, and the bar fight atmosphere reinforced that belief. This chapter of the league's history also highlights how sports evolve alongside culture. Just as the United States eventually shifted from prohibition speakeasies to polished nightclubs, the NFL shifted from muddy fields and fistfights to domed stadiums and instant replay. But the DNA of those outlaw years remains. Even today, when two teams square off in a heated rivalry and tempers flare, fans tap into that same primal excitement. The difference now is that order and business interests keep the chaos under control. What we must remember is that these early years were not a flaw in the NFL's history, but the foundation of it. The league needed those gritty seasons to carve out its identity and separate itself from college football, which prided itself on prestige and tradition. The NFL had no such luxury. It had to fight, sometimes literally, for recognition, for survival, and for fans. That scrappy beginning resonates even today, reminding us that before the billion-dollar logos and immaculate branding, the NFL was raw, unfiltered, and dangerous. This was the era when the league looked more like a bar fight than a business, and while it may seem chaotic through modern eyes, it was precisely that chaos that forged the sport's enduring toughness and allure. Fans didn't just watch football, they lived it, brawls and all. And in those smoky bars and muddy fields, a legend was being written. The outlaw spirit lived on through every tackle, every punch, and every muddy melee, shaping football into the sport America couldn't turn away from. When you peel back the layers of the NFL's early outlaw years, you don't just find dusty stadiums, brawling players, or bootleggers sneaking kegs under bleachers. What you really discover are the characters, the men themselves, the tough, wild, larger-than-life figures who shaped the league before it was even considered legitimate. The truth is, the NFL in the 1920s and 1930s was as much about personalities as it was about touchdowns. These were men who came from coal mines, steel mills, saloons, boxing rings, and sometimes the streets. They were football pioneers, but more than that, they were fighters for survival, toughened by life and hardened by circumstance. And without their grit, there might not even be an NFL today. Let's start with Bronco Nagurski, one of the most legendary figures to ever step on a field. To many, he wasn't just a football player, he was a force of nature. Born in Minnesota, Nagurski grew up plowing fields with his bare hands and working the land like a man twice his age. By the time he suited up for the Chicago Bears, he was a bruising fullback who could run through entire defenses. And if you were unlucky enough to try and tackle him, chances were you'd be picking yourself off the turf. But Nagurski wasn't just a football player. He was also a professional wrestler, earning extra money when NFL salaries were meager. Think about that. The man was literally fighting in arenas during the week, then bulldozing opponents on Sundays. He embodied the outlaw era perfectly. Raw, powerful, and unfiltered. Then there's Red Grange, the galloping ghost, who brought a different type of chaos. Grange wasn't a brawler in the sense of fists flying, but his arrival turned the league upside down. When George Halas signed him in 1925, the NFL suddenly became a box office sensation. Grange played with a speed and grace that made defenses look foolish, But off the field, he was part of a wild circus tour, playing 19 games in 67 days. Imagine that to day 19 football games in barely 2 months. Players were exhausted, towns were electrified, and Grange's every step felt like a rebellion against the old amateur ways of college football. He was proof that football's future wasn't tea in ivory towers or polished stadiums. It was out in the chaos with the common people. Of course, no discussion of characters from the Outlaw years is complete without mentioning Iron Mike Michalski, a lineman who played in the 1920s and 30s. Michalski had a reputation for toughness that bordered on mythical. He broke fingers, split lips, and smashed through opponents like a wrecking ball. But he also played through injuries that would sideline today's stars for months. There are stories of Michalski getting his nose broken mid-game, stuffing cotton up his nostrils, and returning to the trenches as if nothing happened. That was the Outlaw code. Pain was part of the job, and quitting simply wasn't an option. And then there were the two-way players. Men who didn't just play offense or defense, they played both, often without substitution. Jim Thorpe, the original superstar, embodied this better than anyone. Thorpe wasn't just a football player. He was an Olympic gold medalist, a baseball player, and one of the greatest all-around athletes to ever live. When he played for the Canton Bulldogs, he ran, passed, kicked, and tackled with an unmatched ferocity. But he also lived like an outlaw off the field, his career marred by controversies over professionalism and money. In many ways, Thorpe symbolized the NFL's struggle. Raw talent battling a system that wasn't quite ready to embrace it. We can't ignore the Chicago Bears' reputation as a team full of tough guys, almost like a gang in football uniforms. George Halas not only built his team on bruisers like Nagurski, but cultivated a culture where intimidation was part of the game plan. Stories abound of Bears players roughing up opponents well beyond the whistle, pushing referees' patience, and using sheer physical dominance to establish their reputation. For fans in Chicago, this wasn't just football, it was theater. It was the city's toughness personified on the gridiron. Beyond the superstars, there were countless characters whose names always make the history books, but who left an imprint on the Outlaw years. Guys like Clark Hinkle, a fullback for the Green Bay Packers, who once squared off with Bronco Nagurski in legendary collisions that fans still talk about. Or Johnny Blood McNally, perhaps one of the most colorful characters of them all. Blood was a running back with a flair for the dramatic, incredible athlete with a taste for mischief. He once climbed onto hotel ledges after curfew to sneak back into his room, and another time he hitched a ride on top of a moving train just to save money on travel. McNally was as much a showman as he was a player, and his antics made him both beloved and infamous. The fascinating thing about these characters is how they reflect the America of their time. Many of these men were first-generation immigrants or the children of immigrants. They grew up in working-class towns where toughness wasn't a choice but a necessity. Football became a way out, a ticket to something bigger, even if the pay was low and the risks were sky-high. They carried with them the spirit of survival, and when they stepped on the field, that spirit translated into a brand of football that was raw, violent, and unforgettable. But it wasn't just players. Coaches, promoters, and owners were characters too. George Halas, Curly Lambeau, and Art Rooney weren't polished executives. They were hustlers, promoters, men who bet on football's future with grit and gamble. Art Rooney famously used Racetrack winnings to bankroll the Pittsburgh franchise. Halas doubled as coach, promoter, and publicist, doing whatever it took to keep his Bears afloat. Curly Lambeau built the Packers out of a packing company team and convinced local fans to buy stock in their club to keep it alive. These men weren't boardroom types, they were visionaries in the trenches, shaping the game with as much fight as the players themselves. And while chaos was rampant, so too were the stories of camaraderie. Players from rival teams would brawl during the game, then drink together afterward in smoky taverns. Fights on the field didn't always breed hatred. They were part of the culture, a release of energy, a signal of respect. The Outlaw Era, for all its madness, was also about building bonds, and many of these men stayed lifelong friends. When fans talk about the good old days, you aren't imagining a polished NFL product with billion-dollar stadiums and marketing deals. They're thinking about characters like Johnny Blood sneaking out windows, Bronco Nagurski flattening defenders, or Jim Thorpe booting a ball through the uprights with ease. They're remembering a league where every man had a story, and every story was bigger than the game itself. But these characters didn't just define the chaos, they gave it heart. They gave the NFL its identity at a time when it desperately needed it. Without them, the league might have faded into obscurity, another failed sports experiment. But because of them, because of their toughness, their antics, their wildness, the NFL had something no other sport could match. It had legends forged in grit. And it's those legends who remind us today that the NFL wasn't built on smooth boardroom deals or TV contracts. It was built on men who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty, to bleed for the game, and to carve their names into football history. As we leave behind these unforgettable characters, we move into the next chapter of the Outlaw years, where the league itself begins to look less like a sport and more like a sprawling bar fight played out on muddy fields. As we leave behind these unforgettable characters, we move into the next chapter of the Outlaw years, where the league itself begins to look less like a sport and more like a sprawling bar fight played out on muddy fields. As we leave behind these unforgettable characters, we move into the next chapter of the Outlaw years, where the league itself begins to look less like a sport and more like a sprawling bar fight played out on muddy fields. When you picture an NFL stadium today, you think of a state-of-the-art facility with jumbo screens, luxury boxes, corporate sponsors, and meticulously planned security details. Families attend together, fans wear official jerseys, and there is an orderliness 7 in the midst of wild cheering that makes the game accessible to millions. But rewind nearly a century, and the scene looked almost unrecognizable. The stadiums of the NFL's Outlaw years were less like polished venues for professional sport and far more like rowdy fight clubs, places where the line between spectator and player often blurred, and where chaos was often as entertaining as the game itself. This was an era before billion-dollar broadcast deals, before owners built gleaming temples to the game. Instead, matches were held in small-town fields, converted baseball diamonds, or hastily fenced-off lots. Crowds didn't sit in cushioned seats, they stood shoulder-to shoulder pressed against crude wooden barriers, with some climbing trees or rooftops to catch a glimpse. And unlike today's fan culture, where rules and regulations are strictly enforced, early football culture embraced a spirit of rawness. Fans heckled relentlessly, players fought openly, and referees were often targets of the same hostility meant for the opposing team. One could argue that the stadiums of the 1920s and 1930s mirrored the country's atmosphere at large. This was Prohibition era, America place already buzzing with lawlessness, gang rivalries, and underground dealings. Football, still a scrappy upstart league compared to baseball or boxing, carried that same renegade aura. People came not just for a sporting contest, but for the chance to witness mayhem, to cheer their local tough men, and maybe even to be part of the action themselves. Fans as part of the fight in those early days, fans weren't passive observers. They were combustible elements in a powder keg environment. Reports from the time detail instances where fans stormed the field to argue with referees, or even threw punches at opposing players. If a hometown star was roughed up, local fans felt it was their personal duty to respond in kind. Some games ended not with a final whistle, but with mass brawls involving players, coaches, and spectators alike. The lack of infrastructure only fueled the chaos. Without professional stadium security or modern-day crowd control, referees and players had little protection from enraged fans. It wasn't unusual for fights in the stands to spill over onto the field, forcing the game to pause or even end early. One can imagine the sight: a muddy field. Two teams barely distinguishable through torn uniforms, and hundreds of fans surging forward to join the fray. This atmosphere might sound unruly by modern standards, but it was a powerful bonding agent for communities. For many working-class towns, football was their chance to assert pride, toughness, and identity. Supporting your local team was not just a matter of leisure-read, was a declaration of solidarity. And sometimes, that meant showing up with fists clenched and tempers ready to flare. Players as brawlers first, athletes second. Players weren't above the culture, they were products of it. Many early NFL players came from hard-scrabble backgrounds, places where toughness mattered more than technique. They were coal miners, steel workers, farmhands, or men who had honed their grit in military service during World War I. Football was an extension of their daily battles. And the game was less about polished skill than about surviving punishment and dishing it back out. The rough style of play often spilled beyond legal tackles and blocks. Punching, kicking, gouging, these weren't anomalies. They were weekly features. And referees, often outnumbered and under pressure from hostile crowds, had limited authority to stop it. A player who could fight was as valuable as a player who could run fast or throw long. It wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Players built reputations not just on scoring touchdowns, but on their willingness to engage in on-field scraps. Legends spread quickly about men who played through broken noses, who refused to leave the field after being knocked unconscious, or who retaliated against cheap shots with even more brutal retribution. The fans loved it because it mirrored their own lives. In the factories, on the farms, and in the bars, toughness was the ultimate currency. Stadiums as battlefields. The venues themselves contributed to the mayhem, unlike the massive coliseums of today. Many early football games were played in places barely equipped to host professional competition. Temporary bleachers creaked under the weight of fans. Fences were easily broken through, and the fields themselves were often little more than patches of dirt or grass. Conditions were poor, weather often made things worse, and chaos reigned when crowds surged too close. Imagine attending a game in 1925 in a small town in Ohio or Pennsylvania. There's no scoreboard. The referee's whistle can barely be heard over the shouting. Mud cakes the players so thoroughly that numbers are indistinguishable. Fans are pressed against the sideline, some shouting insults at players, others ready to leap in. In this setting, it's easy to see how football became part sport, part spectacle, part brawl. Why fans loved it from the perspective of fans. This was exactly what they wanted. Football was not a gentleman's game, was a proving ground. Baseball might have been the national pastime, but football was the sport of the working man. It was raw, unpredictable, and reflected the hard edges of American life. During an era of economic instability and social upheaval, the working-class fan base connected with the sport's physical brutality. Life was already hard. A game that mirrored that struggle felt authentic. And in an age without the sanitized entertainment of television, movies, or streaming, the immediacy of a football brawl was irresistible. People showed up knowing they might witness something unpredictable, wild, and unforgettable. Seeds of modern fandom, though the rough culture might seem extreme today, it laid the groundwork for modern fandom. That passion, that sense of identity tied to a team, has endured even as the NFL polished its image and built billion-dollar stadiums. Today's rowdy fan bases in places like Philadelphia, Buffalo, or Cleveland can trace their DNA back to these outlaw years, when loyalty was proven in bruises, shouts, and sometimes fists. In a way, the early fans and players were building the mythology of the sport in real time. Every fight, every brawl, every confrontation added to the lore. Football wasn't just about who won or lost, it was about survival, toughness, and honor. Those values, embedded in the game's culture, are still celebrated today, even if the methods of expression have changed. The transition ahead by the 1930s and 1940s, the league began to realize that sustaining itself required taming this fight club atmosphere. Owners wanted to attract bigger crowds, sponsors, and eventually radio and television deals. For that, the sport had to look more legitimate and less like a weekly bar fight. But for a time, those chaotic stadiums were the crucible in which the NFL's identity was forged. The lawlessness, the unpredictability, and the violence were not simply unfortunate byproducts of the game. They were central to its early appeal. Football survived not in spite of its rough culture, but because of it. Fans who craved authenticity, toughness, and raw energy made football their sport. And they kept showing up, week after week, ready for both touchdowns and tussles. The NFL today is sleek, professional, and global. But beneath the billion-dollar shine is a legacy of grit, fists, and the kind of raw culture that once made its stadiums feel like fight clubs. That outlaw spirit is what connected early fans to the game, and it remains embedded in football's DNA. And just as stadiums once blurred the line between football and fight club, the next chapter of our story dives into how specific moments of chaos and the legendary characters behind them cemented football's reputation as America's roughest sport. If you thought the early NFL was about touchdowns, clean tackles, and cheering crowds, think again. Some of the most memorable stories from the league's outlaw years weren't just about who won or lost on the scoreboard, but about who walked off the field with a black eye, a ripped jersey, or a permanent grudge. These weren't just football games. They were battles sometimes more bare-knuckle brawl than gridiron chess match. And each infamous moment built the legend of a league that seemed to teeter between sport and street fight. Let's rewind to the 1920s and 1930s. The league was still young, desperate for attention, and anything but polished. Stadiums were half full, referees were often overwhelmed, and players didn't shy away from turning personal grudges into public spectacles. That meant some games quickly spiraled into chaos, remembered not for the touchdowns scored, but for the fights that broke out in the mud right in front of paying fans. One of the most infamous clashes came in 1923, when the Canton Bulldogs faced off against their rivals, the Massillon Tigers. These two teams had history dating back even before the NFL officially existed. Their rivalry was so bitter it bordered on personal vendetta, and when the players took the field that day, everyone knew sparks would fly. By halftime, the game had descended into pushing, shoving, and full-on fistfights. Spectators in the stands cheered like it was a boxing match, and referees simply couldn't control the violence. Canton ended up winning the scoreboard battle, but the real story was how many punches landed before the final whistle. But this wasn't an isolated case. The Chicago Bears, known for their rough style, were at the center of multiple infamous brawls during the 1930s. George Halas wanted his Bears to be feared as much as respected, and his rosters often reflected that philosophy. In one notorious matchup against the Green Bay Packers, tension spilled over so badly that fans swore they saw more swinging fists than completed passes. The Packers, equally tough under Curly Lambeau, weren't about to back down. Players hit after the whistle, cheap-shotted opponents, and left bodies sprawled across the field. That game didn't just cement the Bears-Packers rivalry, it branded it as one of the fiercest in all of sports. Then there was the story of the 1934 sneakers game, remembered for its icy conditions and dramatic finish, but also for the bruising physicality that came with it. While the New York Giants switched to sneakers for better footing and beat the Chicago Bears, the game was brutal to the core. Players were sliding, shoving, and tackling with reckless abandon, leading to several knockdowns that resembled hockey brawls more than football plays. For fans, this was entertainment gold. For the league, it was proof that chaos could sell tickets. Perhaps no single game encapsulated the outlaw image better than the infamous clash between the Pittsburgh Pirates, later renamed the Steelers, and the Philadelphia Eagles in 1939. Conditions were sloppy, tempers were short, and when a questionable call from the referee lit the fuse, both benches cleared. Players stormed the field, throwing haymakers in a melee that stretched across nearly 30 yards. Newspapers the next day described it as football turned fight night. And while the NFL's leadership squirmed, fans couldn't get enough of the wild drama. And then there were the one-on-one legendary fights that became part of league lore. Take the tale of Iron Mike Michalski, a lineman for the Packers in the late 1920s and early 30s. Known as one of the toughest men in football, Michalski once flattened an opposing player with a punch so powerful that it left the man sprawled on the field for minutes. The crowd roared, and though Michalski was penalized, his reputation as one of football's great enforcers only grew. Stories like his reinforced the idea that toughness wasn't just celebrated, was required. Beyond the players, even coaches weren't immune to the outlaw spirit. George Halas himself was rumored to have jawed with officials and opponents in ways that would make modern commissioners cringe. And Curly Lambeau? He wasn't afraid to tell his men to hit harder, intimidate more, and leave a mark that went beyond the scoreboard. Their coaching philosophies practically encouraged the kind of gritty, infamous moments that shaped the NFL's early identity. Fans, of course, loved every minute of it. Imagine being in the stands in 1932, watching a snow-covered championship game in Chicago, where tempers flared as often as passes were thrown. For working-class fans who spent their week in factories, mines, or on farms, this was their release of spectacle that matched the rough-and-tumble reality of their lives. They didn't just tolerate the chaos, they demanded it. Fights in the stands often mirrored fights on the field, blurring the line between sport and spectacle. What's fascinating is how these infamous games and fights shaped the NFL's reputation at a time when it desperately needed to stand out. Baseball was America's pastime, boxing was glamorous, and college football was more respected. For the NFL to carve out its niche, it had to be different. And being different meant being grittier, tougher, and yes, sometimes downright lawless. These legendary clashes gave the league an edge, a kind of dangerous allure that drew fans in, even if it made traditionalists shake their heads. Even decades later, players and fans would look back on these games as defining moments. They weren't polished, they weren't always fair, but they were unforgettable. And in sports, being unforgettable is half the battle. The NFL's outlaw image wasn't built on marketing campaigns or polished logos, it was built on sweat. Fists, mud, and grudges settled under the glare of stadium lights. When we talk about infamous games today, we often point to late hits or controversial calls in the Super Bowl. But in the outlaw years, an infamous game meant something different. It meant a brawl so raw that people in the crowd remembered it for years. A fight so wild that newspapers made it front-page news, or a rivalry so heated it felt more like war than sport. These weren't blemishes on the league's history. They were the sparks that kept the fire alive. In the end, the NFL survived those outlaw years not in spite of the fights and infamous games, but because of them. They gave the league its edge, its identity, and its stories. Every punch thrown, every bench-clearing brawl, every game that descended into chaos was a step toward building a legend that fans still celebrate today. It was messy, it was brutal, and it was unforgettable, and without those infamous games, the NFL might never have become the juggernaut it is now. These clashes weren't just about blood and bruises. They were about loyalty, pride, and a league trying to prove itself in a world that didn't always take it seriously. And for fans, that made them perfect. Because in the outlaw years of the NFL, you didn't just watch football. You watched history being punched, shoved, and fought into existence. In the smoky back rooms of Prohibition era America, where the click of dice and the shuffle of cards mixed with the laughter of men who knew they were living outside the law, football was never too far away. In fact, for many, it became the perfect companion to the underground economy of mob bosses and gamblers who had the nation's working-class neighborhoods wrapped around their fingers. To understand the NFL's outlaw years, you cannot ignore the pull of mob money and the shadow of betting scandals. It was not just the occasional bribe whispered over a drink, it was a culture. It's a set of risks and temptations that put young players, desperate owners, and the entire league in precarious territory. Yet, without this flirtation with the edge, the league might never have become the powerhouse it is today. When we say the NFL flirted with the edge, we mean it literally. The league walked a tightrope between legitimacy and scandal. On one side were the die-hard fans, packing wooden bleachers, craving violent action. On the other side was the money trail, often greased with mob connections, cash envelopes, and promises that blurred the line between sport and entertainment. In many ways, this tension mirrored America itself during the 1920s and 30s, a nation caught between morality and survival, between law and hustle. The mob's interest in football was not accidental. Organized crime had already sunk deep hooks into boxing and horse racing, to sports where gambling dictated the stakes. Football, still young and chaotic, was fertile ground. With teams barely scraping by financially, with owners needing quick cash, and with players earning salaries that could vanish with one injury, the temptation of easy money was everywhere. It only took a phone call from a local bookmaker, whispered suggestion to miss that tackle or drop that pass, for doubts to creep in about whether games were truly clean. One of the earliest whispers of scandals surrounded college football, which by the 1920s was bigger than the NFL itself. Games like Notre Dame versus Army drew tens of thousands, and mobsters knew the potential for profit. By the time the NFL started finding its footing, the Underworld already had a blueprint for how to exploit a sport's unpredictability. Point shaving, fixing spreads, bribing referees. These were tools honed in other arenas and adapted for football's new frontier. It wasn't just the players who were vulnerable. Owners, too, were susceptible. Remember, early franchises were often run by small businessmen, bar owners, or promoters with loose ties to the underworld. For them, football was an investment, and investments needed cash flow. If mobsters offered help, who was going to say no? Teams like the Chicago Bears, the Green Bay Packers, and the New York Giants were working hard to build legitimacy. But smaller outfits often leaned on questionable backers just to pay travel costs or buy equipment. This created a climate where mob money was less of an exception and more of an open secret. Fans, of course, suspected things. When a player dropped an easy interception or a star back fumbled at the worst possible moment, rumors spread like wildfire. Was it nerves, bad luck, or something darker? Even though there is little hard evidence of widespread fixes in the NFL compared to boxing or baseball, the perception alone added to the outlaw aura. The league didn't have to be corrupt at every level. The suggestion that it might be was enough to fuel the myth of danger and grit. Consider the broader culture. This was the age when Al Capone ruled Chicago, when Lucky Luciano controlled New York, when Meyer Lansky was inventing the modern gambling syndicate. Their tentacles reached everywhere: saloons, speakeasies, racetracks. Why wouldn't they test football too? The NFL was still so fragmented that mobsters could operate in certain cities without much oversight. A bribe to a local official here, a friendly loan to an owner there. And suddenly organized crime had its fingerprints on Sunday afternoons. But here's the remarkable part. Instead of sinking under the weight of scandal, the NFL used this environment to sharpen its identity. The league doubled down on discipline. Commissioners began cracking down on even the appearance of gambling connections. Rules about player conduct were enforced with greater seriousness. While the mob lurked, the NFL slowly carved out legitimacy by declaring, "We are not boxing. We will not be tainted." It was a slow process, but essential for the survival of the league. That does not mean the temptations vanished. Into the 1940s and beyond, the NFL still wrestled with betting controversies. Players were banned, referees questioned, and whispers followed teams that made inexplicable mistakes. The very fact that football was such a violent, unpredictable game made it perfect for gamblers. It only took one key play to swing the spread. Even as the league tried to clean itself up, the specter of mob money remained a constant reminder of its outlaw roots. Perhaps the most fascinating angle is how these scandals shaped the fans' perception. Rather than being turned away, many fans leaned in. Scandal added intrigue. Was that touchdown real? Was that fumble staged? Football became theater, not just sport. In a way, the flirtation with mob money made the league more compelling to a public that already lived in a world where rules were made to be broken. What we learn from this chapter of NFL history is that flirtation does not always mean corruption. It can also mean survival. By brushing so closely with scandal, the league realized it needed to define itself as a clean, respectable institution. Every time an owner rejected mob overtures, every time a commissioner clamped down on shady dealings, the NFL moved one step closer to legitimacy. Without the pressure of these temptations, maybe the league would not have had the same urgency to professionalize. Still, the Outlaw Era stuck. Even today, when sports betting is legalized in many states and billion-dollar partnerships exist between leagues and casinos, echoes of the past remain. Fans still wonder if money influences outcomes. They still whisper about spreads, referees, and mystery calls. It is part of football's DNA, inherited from those early decades when mob bosses hovered in the shadows. And that, ultimately, is the heart of the story. The NFL did not collapse under the weight of betting scandals. Instead, it flirted with danger, survived, and grew stronger. The very chaos of those outlaw years, with bootleggers, funding teams, mobsters tempting players, and gamblers circling the field, forced the league to evolve. Today, when we see a clean, polished, billion-dollar brand, it is easy to forget the smoky rooms, the cash envelopes, the risky deals that nearly derailed everything before it began. The outlaw years were not just about violence on the field, they were about temptation off of it. Football had to prove it could resist, or at least outlast, the mob's reach. And in doing so, it forged an identity that balanced grit with integrity. That tension between chaos and order, danger and respectability is what makes the NFL story so compelling even a century later. The league's flirtation with mob money reminds us of one thing: greatness often emerges not in spite of shadows, but because of them. The early years of professional football have often been described as unruly, chaotic, and unpredictable. Teams came and went. Stadiums were more like sandlots than grand cathedrals of sport, and the league itself seemed closer to a traveling carnival than a polished professional organization. Yet in the middle of this chaos, certain men emerged as heroes. They were rough, they were flawed, but they stood tall. They became symbols of toughness, resilience, and leadership in an era when football needed anchors more than anything else. These players were not saints, but they were legends who gave fans someone to believe in during the wild outlaw years of the NFL. Jim Thorpe is perhaps the most legendary of them all. Already celebrated as one of the greatest athletes of the 20th century, Thorpe brought star power to the fledgling NFL. In 1920, he was named the first president of what was then called the American Professional Football Association. His presence alone gave legitimacy to the league. Thorpe was a Native American who had conquered the Olympics, dominated college football, and thrived in professional baseball. On the football field, he was a punishing runner, a skilled kicker, and a natural leader. But more than his stats, it was his persona that mattered. At a time when football seemed filled with hustlers and roughnecks, Thorpe was proof that greatness could be found in this game. Fans flocked to see him because he was bigger than the chaos around him. Then there was Red Grange, the galloping ghost. Grange became the NFL's first true superstar when he left the University of Illinois and signed with the Chicago Bears in 1925. His arrival sent shockwaves across the sports world. College football had been king, but Grange's move brought legitimacy to the professional side. He wasn't just a great player, he was a cultural phenomenon. His debut tour with the Bears drew massive crowds, packing stadiums from New York to Los Angeles. For a league trying to shake off the reputation of being a sideshow for bootleggers and barroom brawlers, Grange was the fresh air it desperately needed. He was clean-cut, fast, and electrifying. When he ran, fans saw a future for football that looked brighter than the lawless past. While Thorpe and Grange gave the league legitimacy and star power, others embodied toughness in ways that mirrored the gritty culture of the time. Bronco Nagurski became a symbol of raw physical power, standing 6 feet 2 inches and weighing over 230 pounds. Nagurski was built like a freight train in an era when most players barely topped 190. He played for the Bears and became known as the toughest runner the league had ever seen. Nagurski would plow through defenders as if they were nothing more than minor obstacles on his way to the end zone. Stories about his toughness became folklore. One tale has him breaking through a defensive line, knocking over a safety, then crashing into a stadium wall, leaving the defender sprawled while Nagurski dusted himself off and walked away. In a league where fights often broke out and discipline was scarce, Nagurski became a hero because he turned the violence of the game into dominance on the field. Sammy Baugh, known as Slinging Sammy, represented another kind of heroism. While many players relied on brute force, Baugh introduced finesse. He became the NFL's first great passing quarterback in the 1930s and 1940s. His precision and creativity transformed how the game was played. Fans who are used to ground-and-pound football suddenly saw a new possibility: aerial attacks that thrilled crowds and shifted momentum in seconds. Baugh's presence helped show that the NFL wasn't just a slugfest of fists and collisions. It could also be about skill, strategy, and innovation. In a time when the league's reputation teetered between brilliance and barbarism, Baugh provided proof that artistry had a place in professional football. But it wasn't just about skill or strength. Some heroes stood tall because they carried themselves with dignity in an era when the league was far from respectable. Fritz Pollard was one such figure. Pollard was not only one of the first African-American players in the NFL, but also one of its first black head coaches. At a time when racism was rampant in America, Pollard faced hostility both on and off the field. Opposing players targeted him. Fans hurled slurs. Yet Pollard kept playing and coaching with resilience and pride. He brought discipline and excellence to teams that desperately needed it. Though the NFL would later shamefully ban black players from 1934 to 1946, Pollard's early contributions made him a hero whose courage extended beyond football. In a league full of outlaws, he stood tall by showing integrity in the face of bigotry. Another heroic figure of that wild era was George Halas, while remembered today as Papa Bear. The founder of the Chicago Bears, Halas was also a player and coach during the league's rugged infancy. He wasn't the biggest or the fastest, but his leadership and vision helped guide football out of chaos and into a structured league. Halas fought to professionalize the game, pushing for stability, contracts, and long-term growth. In many ways, he was the opposite of the shady promoters and hustlers who often controlled teams in those days. His presence gave fans confidence that professional football had leaders who could turn the Outlaw League into a lasting sport. Of course, heroes in this era were not always polished. Many of them lived hard, played harder, and carried scars both on their bodies and reputations. Players often worked brutal factory jobs in the off-season, struggling to make ends meet. Yet, when they stepped onto the field, they played with a ferocity that inspired admiration. To the fans, these men were working-class heroes. They weren't millionaires playing for glory. They were everyday tough men proving their worth on muddy fields in front of small but passionate crowds. The media, too, began to pick up on these heroes amid the mayhem. Sports writers of the 1920s and 1930s crafted larger-than-life stories about men like Thorpe, Grange, and Nagurski. The press knew that fans craved heroes to balance the tales of fights, gambling, and shady business deals that surrounded the sport. These stories became part of the mythology of football, giving the NFL a foundation of legends to build upon. It's also important to remember that in this era, the word hero did not mean flawless. Many of these players were rough men from rough backgrounds. They weren't groomed media stars or polished celebrities. But that was precisely why fans loved them. They embodied resilience, toughness, and survival, the very qualities that mirrored the struggles of ordinary Americans during the Great Depression and the years leading into World War II. In a sense, these football heroes were reflections of their times. The outlaw years of the NFL could have easily destroyed the league. Violence on the field, shady business practices off it, and a lack of discipline threatened to make pro football nothing more than a short-lived novelty. But the presence of heroes, whether through star power, toughness, leadership, or integrity, kept the sport alive. They gave fans something to cheer for, something to respect, and something to believe in. Without Jim Thorpe, there might not have been legitimacy. Without Red Grange, there might not have been mass popularity. Without Bronco Nagurski, there might not have been a symbol of toughness. Without Sammy Baugh, there might not have been innovation. Without Fritz Pollard, there might not have been courage in the face of discrimination. And without George Halas, there might not have been stability or vision. These were the heroes who, amid the mayhem, stood tall. The NFL may have looked like an outlaw's playground in its earliest years, but it survived because of these larger-than-life figures. They balanced the chaos with greatness. They turned barroom brawls into heroic struggles worth watching. And they gave professional football the chance to grow into something greater than anyone in those days could have imagined. In the end, the heroes of this lawless era didn't just play the game, they saved it. They gave the league a foundation of toughness, brilliance, and resilience that carried it through its most unstable years. When the dust settled and the fists stopped flying, it was these men who stood tall as the true champions of football's wild beginning. When fans today think about the money behind the National Football League, they imagine billion-dollar TV deals, sleek stadium naming rights, and corporate owners in luxury boxes. But in the earliest decades of the game, before the NFL became a polished machine, the flow of money looked very different. It came in envelopes of cash slid across a bar counter. It came in from gamblers, hustlers, and sometimes outright gangsters who saw football not as a corporate product, but as an exciting sideshow to fund, manipulate, and profit from. To understand the outlaw years of football, you have to follow the money. And when you follow the money, you find characters who are just as colorful and dangerous as the players on the field. The 1920s and 30s were a time when America's underworld was booming. Prohibition made alcohol illegal, but it also made organized crime immensely rich. Mobsters controlled liquor, speakeasies, nightclubs, and a thriving shadow economy. With piles of cash that couldn't always be spent in legitimate business, many of these figures turned to sports as both entertainment and investment. Boxing was the first major playground for mobsters. They fixed fights, paid off referees, and owned fighters like assets in a portfolio. Football, still young and desperate for money, soon became another avenue. Early professional football teams were fragile. They didn't have big stadiums, massive TV contracts, or guaranteed attendance. They were community operations, often scraping together enough cash to pay players week by week. That made them vulnerable. A wealthy man with shady connections could step in and bankroll a team. Sometimes out of love for the game, but often as a way to launder money, build influence, or control outcomes. In a sport where referees were underpaid and rules loosely enforced, the possibilities for profit were everywhere. One of the most famous examples came from the Midwest. Chicago, already a hotbed of gangland activity thanks to Al Capone's empire, also hosted some of the toughest early football. Teams like the Chicago Cardinals and barnstorming squads around the region attracted gamblers the way honey attracts flies. It wasn't uncommon for a team's payroll to be quietly funded by men who also ran gambling parlors. Winning on the field mattered, but sometimes it mattered just as much that the right people won money in the betting pools. There are legendary stories of envelopes of cash handed to players right before kickoff. Sometimes as bonus incentives, sometimes as not-so-subtle bribes. In some cases, entire rosters were built because a gangster wanted to showcase his local heroes. Much like a prizefighter in a stable of boxers. And because early pro football didn't have the rigid salary caps or union rules of today, these underworld financiers could pay however they wanted cash, cars, or even promises of protection. The most intriguing part of this outlaw financing was how normal it seemed at the time. To the average fan, there was in T a clear line between a respectable businessman and a man with mob ties. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh were filled with hustlers who owned bars, ran backroom gambling operations, and also funded sports teams. For struggling franchises, the money was lifeblood. Without it, some clubs wouldn't have survived a single season. The NFL, desperate to grow, often turned a blind eye. It wasn't just direct ownership. Hustlers and gamblers also bankrolled games in more subtle ways. Promoters would sponsor matches, guaranteeing payouts so teams would travel to their town. They'd then make their profit on side bets, ticket markups, or concessions. Some historians suggest that the survival of the NFL during the Depression years might not have been possible without this underworld money, quietly keeping the gears turning. Take, for example, the Pottsville Maroons, one of the most infamous early NFL teams. Their story is often told as one of heartbreak and controversy over a stripped championship. But beneath that tale lies a reality. Like many teams of their era, they leaned on money that wasn't always clean. Investors weren't always civic leaders. Sometimes they were men who thrived in the gray zones of the economy. And Pottsville wasn't alone. From Pennsylvania coal country to the steel towns of Ohio, early pro football-esque financial roots were tangled with the cash flows of industries, both legitimate and illicit. The parallels to boxing are striking. In boxing, mobsters fixed fights to ensure big payoffs. In football, while outright fixing was rarer due to the chaos of the game, the influence of money still seeped into outcomes. Star players might be convinced to play hurt or sit out, depending on who was paying them under the table. Referees might miss a crucial holding call if they had reason to. And promoters knew that a good fight or a good football brawl sold tickets better than anything else. That's why the rough style of play was rarely discouraged. It made gamblers and hustlers money when crowds came back wanting more. But it wasn't all sinister. Some of these outlaw money men genuinely loved the game. They saw it as the working man's sport, raw and unpolished, and they wanted to be part of it. Unlike baseball, which was already buttoned up and corporatized, football was a frontier. Investing in a team was like being a pioneer. For some gangsters, it gave them legitimacy. Owning or bankrolling a football team meant being seen in public with athletes, coaches, and community leaders. It was a strange kind of respectability, built on a foundation of moonshine profits and backroom deals. The players, for their part, didn't ask too many questions. A paycheck was a paycheck, and in the Depression, money was scarce. If the man handing you your week-ass salary also happened to run a speakeasy or numbers racket, you didn't complain. You strapped on your leather helmet, stepped on the muddy field, and played for 60 brutal minutes. That was the culture. Tough men, tough money, and no illusions about where it came from. Looking back, it's astonishing to think how fragile the NFL was in those years. And how much it depended on money that would be unthinkable today. The modern league markets itself as family-friendly, wholesome, and polished. But in its outlaw years, it was a product of its time a sport, born in smoky bars. Played on dirt fields and financed by men who lived outside the law. That doesn't diminish the game's greatness. In fact, it adds to its mystique. It shows that football was forged in fire, chaos, and risk. And here's the irony. Without those gangsters and hustlers, the league we know today might not exist. They kept teams alive when no one else would. They poured money into a sport no one believed in yet. And while their motives weren't always noble, Their impact was undeniable. The NFL's rise from outlaws to empire was built on the backsand, the bank accounts of men who thrived in the shadows. As we move deeper into this story, one thing becomes clear. The NFL's outlaw years weren't just about the violence on the field. They were about the world off at the smoky bars, the whispered bets, the envelopes of cash, and the men who saw football as one more racket to run. And in that mix of chaos and ambition, the seeds of America's most powerful sport were planted. Because when the lights of Sunday football shine today, it's easy to forget that once upon a time, in the back rooms of speakeasies and the pockets of hustlers, the game was just struggling to survive. And survival often came at a price. The outlaw years of professional football weren't just about players throwing punches or fans climbing over fences to join the chaos. Behind the chalk lines and muddy fields, the sidelines themselves told an equally gripping story. Coaches and team executives weren't the polished corporate figures we see today, dressed in tailored suits and carefully groomed for press conferences. Instead, they were often larger-than-life personalities, schemers, motivators, and sometimes hustlers who had one foot in football and the other in the murkier corners of America's Prohibition era economy. The sidelines, in those days, could feel more like the smoky back room of a speakeasy than the clean, camera-ready sidelines we know in the modern NFL. Coaches in the 1920s and 1930s had to operate in a football environment where rules were still flexible, officiating was wildly inconsistent, and financial stability for teams was shaky at best. This wasn't the NFL of billionaire owners, television contracts, and strict salary caps. Teams frequently folded, merged, or simply disappeared overnight, leaving players unpaid and fans bewildered. In that world, coaches were forced to be more than just strategists. They were recruiters, promoters, businessmen, and sometimes enforcers of discipline in a way that felt closer to managing a street gang than running a professional sports team. Their leadership style had to fit the raw edge of the league, tough, improvisational, and often willing to bend the rules. One of the most infamous examples of crooked dealings tied to coaching was the constant issue of players being poached from rival teams. Contracts were often nothing more than handshake agreements or scribbled notes, and enforcement was spotty. Coaches were notorious for slipping players under the table, payments, or offering incentives like jobs at a local business, sometimes legitimate, often not, to get them onto their rosters. These deals weren't just about building a competitive team. They were survival tactics. A bad season could mean financial ruin for a franchise, and coaches who didn't fight dirty often didn't last long. And then there were the gamblers. The connection between professional football and gambling was strong in the early years, and many coaches had to walk a fine line. Some outright embraced the gambling world, seeing it as a way to bring attention and money to their struggling teams. Others were constantly battling the perception that their games weren't on the level. In fact, suspicions of point shaving and fixed games hovered over the league's early decades. And while concrete proof was rare, the whispers alone were damaging. Coaches found themselves not only game planning for Sunday, but also protecting their players and their reputations from being swallowed up by gambling interests. This gave the sidelines a strange tension. Every decision a coach made was viewed through the lens of both strategy and suspicion. But it wasn't all scandal and backroom deals. Many of these early coaches were also genuine innovators who helped shape the foundation of the modern game. Men like George Halas, who led the Chicago Bears, weren't just tough. They were visionaries. Halas, for example, was deeply competitive and sometimes ruthless in his recruiting tactics. But he also introduced creative play calling and organizational structure that pushed the sport toward legitimacy. Coaches like him understood that if football was ever going to rise above its outlaw reputation, it needed discipline, vision, and a plan to appeal to mainstream America. They fought the perception of chaos with a determination that laid the groundwork for the NFL's survival. The struggle for respectability wasn't confined to X's and O's or recruiting wars. Coaches also had to manage the rowdy behavior of their players. Imagine being a coach in an era when brawling on the field was commonplace, and off the field. Many players were involved in bootlegging or other Prohibition-era hustles. Keeping your roster focused and disciplined was nearly impossible. Coaches frequently resorted to extreme measures, threatening to bench stars for fighting, imposing curfews that were rarely respected, or, in some cases, physically breaking up fights in the locker room themselves. These men weren't managing polished professionals. They were wrangling a group of roughnecks who often viewed authority with skepticism. In many ways, a coach's success came down to how well he could command respect, not just from players, but also from the volatile communities that supported their teams. Take, for example, the case of the Portsmouth Spartans, who would later become the Detroit Lions. Their small-town coach had to manage players, who were beloved by the locals, but often unruly and hard to control. The Spartans played in a stadium that doubled as a community gathering spot, meaning every decision the coach made was scrutinized not only by ownership, but by townsfolk who felt personally invested in the team. The pressure was immense, and mistakes could quickly lead to angry confrontations. These small-time coaches had to navigate civic pride, financial instability, and player chaos, all while trying to win football games. And yet, despite the crooked deals, the gambling clouds, and the constant player discipline issues, the coaches of the Outlaw years carved out a space for football to grow. Their sidelines may have looked chaotic, a mix of angry players, shouting gamblers, and exhausted strategists. But from that chaos, a structure slowly began to emerge. They proved that even in a league that often resembled a traveling carnival more than a professional sport, leadership mattered. Coaches who could inspire loyalty, enforce discipline, and outthink their opponents became the bedrock of the NFL's transformation. As America shifted out of the Prohibition era and into the challenges of the Great Depression, the stakes only grew higher. Their stories remind us that football wasn't built in boardrooms or TV studios. It was built on muddy fields, shaky sidelines, and the backs of tough men who knew the game had to survive no matter the cost. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the NFL stood at a crossroads. For years, the league had thrived on chaos, toughness, and a reputation that leaned more toward barroom brawls than organized sport. But America itself was changing. Prohibition was coming to an end. Urban centers were growing. Mass media was spreading. And fans wanted their football to be more than a brawl in the mud. This was the era where the NFL faced its first great identity crisis: how to move from its roughneck origins into something respectable, marketable, and enduring. The transition was far from smooth, but it would shape the DNA of the modern NFL. Cleaning up the league did not mean stripping away its soul. The NFL couldn't abandon toughness because toughness was football's greatest selling point. But what owners, players, and fans slowly realized was that toughness needed structure, discipline, and legitimacy. Fans didn't just want to see two teams beat each other up. They wanted stars they could cheer for, rivalries they could rally behind, and rules that made the game feel fair rather than chaotic. In many ways, this was football's teenage phase. Still raw, still wild, but beginning to understand the responsibilities of adulthood. One of the first signs of this shift was the introduction of standardized rules and greater enforcement. In the 1920s, referees were often intimidated or ignored. Players could get away with holding, late hits, or outright fights with minimal punishment. But by the 1930s, league officials realized that if football was to attract a broader audience, it couldn't afford to be seen as lawless. Penalties became stricter, suspensions were handed down more consistently, and referees were empowered to take control of games. Fans still got the rough spectacle, but now it came with an air of legitimacy. Another crucial step in reshaping the NFL's image was the emergence of star players who gave the league a face that went beyond violence. Names like Red Grange, known as the Galloping Ghost, became cultural icons. Grange wasn't just a tough football player. He was charismatic, graceful, and marketable. His signing with the Chicago Bears in 1925 and subsequent barnstorming tours across America showed owners that football could sell not just as a gritty fight, but as entertainment. It was a revelation. Fans didn't just want football, they wanted heroes. The 1930s also brought financial and organizational growing pains that forced the league to professionalize. The Great Depression hit teams hard, wiping out weaker franchises and consolidating the league's structure. For survival, the NFL had to become more business-minded, ensuring that franchises were financially stable and that games were worth the price of admission. This economic pressure pushed owners to clean up their product, to make sure that fans felt they were watching something meaningful, rather than just chaos on a field. And yet, even in this period of reform, the outlaw spirit still lingered. Players were often poorly paid, working other jobs in the off-season to make ends meet. Stadiums were rough, fans were rowdy, and the occasional fight still erupted on the field. But what distinguished the 1930s and 1940s from earlier decades was that the league began to frame these moments as exceptions rather than the norm. The narrative was shifting. Football was tough, but not lawless. Hard-hitting, but not criminal. One of the most transformative changes came in how the league marketed itself. Radio broadcasts became a powerful tool, bringing football into homes across America. Broadcasters told stories, built rivalries, and highlighted stars in ways that humanized the sport. Fans no longer just heard about players as anonymous brawlers. They heard their names, their backgrounds, their triumphs, and their struggles. Suddenly, the NFL wasn't just a spectacle, it was a narrative, and Americans love a good story. At the same time, stadium infrastructure improved. Teams realized that if they wanted families and middle-class fans to attend, they had to provide more than just a dirt lot with wooden bleachers. Cities like Chicago, Green Bay, and New York invested in better facilities, which in turn created a more professional image for the league. Families could bring their children. Newspapers could publish photographs that looked dignified rather than chaotic, and the NFL's reputation began to rise. The introduction of the annual NFL Draft in 1936 also played a role in cleaning up the league's image. It brought structure and fairness to player distribution, reducing the chaos of free-for-all signings and shady deals. The draft system signaled to fans that the NFL was serious about order and competitive balance. It was no longer the Wild West. TIT was becoming a league of rules, processes, and a vision for the future. Culturally, the NFL was aligning itself with American values of the time. As the nation struggled through the Depression and later braced for World War II, football was marketed as a test of grit, resilience, and teamwork. These were the same qualities that Americans saw in themselves and wanted to celebrate. Slowly, football was transforming from a fringe pastime of bootleggers and tough men into a sport that represented the nation's spirit. Of course, the process wasn't seamless. Scandals still occurred, fights still broke out, and the shadow of its outlaw past never fully disappeared. But instead of defining the league, these incidents began to be framed as colorful anecdotes from a bygone era. The NFL was no longer embracing its rough reputation, it was outgrowing it. Looking back, it's clear that this era of growing pains was essential. Without it, the NFL might have remained a sideshow, overshadowed by college football or dismissed as too brutal for mainstream acceptance. But by choosing to evolve, by balancing toughness with order, chaos with structure, the league laid the foundation for its eventual rise as America's premier sport. Fans may still love to tell stories of the old bootlegger players, the moonshine-fueled games, and the fistfights that erupted in the mud, But what truly cemented the NFL's future was its ability to mature. The league never lost its edge, but it learned to present that edge in a way that appealed to millions rather than thousands. It turned violence into strategy, brawlers into stars, and chaos into spectacle. The NFL of the 1930s and 1940s was not yet the polished product we know today. But it was no longer the Outlaws League either. It was a league finding its balance, learning to walk the line between entertainment and respectability, between toughness and legitimacy. And in doing so, it captured America's imagination like never before. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation was set. The NFL had begun to outgrow its rough edges, proving that even in a sport born from grit and chaos, evolution was possible. The league's journey from bar fight to business had only just begun. And the decades ahead would test its ability to hold on to its identity while reaching for greatness. The outlaw days of professional football were marked by fistfights, mob ties, bootlegging cash, and the type of chaos that threatened to bury the sport before it even had the chance to rise. Yet, for all the grit and lawlessness, the league never collapsed. Instead, it clawed its way toward something bigger, something more enduring. The NFL's path to respectability was not a straight line, but a series of key turning points where the game, its leaders, and its players made decisions that transformed it from a sideshow spectacle into the foundation of America's most powerful sports league. This was not an overnight shift. It was decades of learning hard lessons, of trial and error, and of slowly replacing fists with rules, mob money with legitimate investment, and circus acts with real competition. To understand how the NFL survived its outlaw years and set the stage for its eventual boom, we need to look closely at the pivotal moments that steered it away from chaos and toward credibility. One of the earliest and most important shifts came with a slow but steady emphasis on rule enforcement. During the 1920s and early 1930s, referees were often more like spectators than officials, hesitant to interfere with players who handled disputes with punches, kicks, or elbows. Games regularly descended into brawls, leaving newspapers to wonder whether this new league could ever appeal to respectable fans. But as the league matured, owners realized that fights, while entertaining to some, limited the audience. If football wanted to be more than a traveling roadshow of bruisers, it needed structure. The hiring of stricter referees and the creation of penalties for unsportsmanlike conduct marked a turning point. Though enforcement was uneven at first, the idea that football could not be lawless if it wanted legitimacy began to take hold. This was one of the first steps toward separating the league from its bar fight reputation. Another defining moment came in the realm of financial legitimacy. For years, the league leaned on shady backers, including bootleggers and local mobsters, who used teams as laundromats for cash or as vanity projects. This lack of financial stability made franchises rise and fall like carnival tents. Teams such as the Duluth Eskimos, the Providence Steamroller, and the Canton Bulldogs burned bright but quickly disappeared, leaving the league fragile. The tide began to turn when wealthy industrialists and businessmen with legitimate fortunes took an interest in football. The Mara family purchasing the New York Giants in 1925 was a seismic shift. Tim Mara, a bookmaker by trade, brought stability to one of the largest markets in the country. His investment showed that football could attract serious backers and that franchises with real money behind them could last. This shift from mobster-backed ventures to family-owned legacies laid the groundwork for the modern NFL model, where stability and market size mattered more than quick profits. On the field, star power also pulled the NFL toward respectability. In its wildest days, football was more about the spectacle of violence than the art of the game. But then came players who transcended the outlaw culture. Red Grange, the galloping ghost, changed everything. When Grange joined the Chicago Bears in 1925, football had its first true national celebrity. He wasn't just a bruiser in the trenches. He was a graceful runner, an icon whose image appeared in newspapers and on posters coast to coast. His presence elevated the sport, attracting middle-class fans who would never have bothered with the drunken brawls of early football. With Grange, the league discovered that star athletes could give the game legitimacy, charm the press, and inspire children to dream of playing, rather than just fighting. The Outlaw League now had heroes and heroes sell tickets in ways that brawlers never could. Another crucial turning point was the NFL's survival through the Great Depression. Many teams folded during those lean years, but the league itself managed to endure. This was a testament to better organization and stronger leadership. It was during this time that George Halas and other pioneering owners tightened the league's operations, insisting on more centralized rules and competitive balance. While barnstorming tours still happened, the Depression forced football to become leaner, smarter, and more consistent. The NFL could no longer afford reckless expansion and collapse. It had to be methodical. This survival through adversity gave the league credibility. It wasn't just a passing fad, but a sport tough enough to withstand the harshest economic times. One of the more symbolic turning points came with the crackdown on gambling. Early football was rife with gamblers and point-shaving scandals, threatening to derail its credibility, much like baseball's infamous Black Sox scandal did in 1919. But unlike baseball, which suffered a near-fatal blow, football addressed its gambling problem with decisive action. Owners and league leaders knew that if fans believed the games were rigged, the NFL would never grow. By banning players involved in shady activities and taking a hard stance against corruption, the league protected its integrity. Though gambling would always lurk in the background of American sports, this early commitment to fair play marked a significant step toward respectability. The cultural shift also came from the fans themselves. In the early years, many spectators came to football for the fights, not the touchdowns. But as the game became more structured and stars like Grange, Bronco Nagurski, and Don Hutson emerged, fans began to appreciate the artistry of strategy, passing, and athletic brilliance. Football was no longer just a brawl. It was a contest of skill. This change in public perception was perhaps the most important turning point of all. Once families and middle-class communities started attending games, the NFL could no longer be dismissed as a violent sideshow. The game was becoming mainstream. Another key factor was the rise of rivalries that captured the public imagination. The Green Bay Packers versus the Chicago Bears became the league's signature grudge match. A clash of towns, cultures, and playing styles that added drama beyond the field. These rivalries drew attention not for the fistfights, but for the passion and loyalty they inspired. Rivalries transformed football into an emotional investment, where fans weren't just watching men fight, they were defending the pride of their city. That emotional buy-in pulled the NFL closer to respectability. Finally, the creation of the NFL championship game in 1933 represented a turning point from chaos to organization. For the first time, the league had a structured postseason, crowning a true champion rather than relying on scattered records or disputed titles. This move brought order and legitimacy to the sport, making it look less like a traveling fight club and more like a professional institution. The 1933 title game between the Bears and the New York Giants was a watershed moment, demonstrating that football could deliver drama and spectacle in a structured, respectable way. Taken together, these moments formed the roadmap from outlaws to order. The NFL didn't shed its rough edges overnight indeed. Many of its early stars still carried the aura of toughness and chaos, but the direction was clear. Through stricter rules, legitimate ownership, star athletes, survival during hard times, a crackdown on corruption, cultural shifts among fans, the rise of rivalries, and the invention of a championship, the league turned a corner. What had once been dismissed as little more than a gang fight with a ball was now on its way to becoming a respected institution. The outlaw years would never fully vanish from football SDN. They still live on in stories of toughness, grit, and bare-knuckle passion, but by the time the NFL reached the late 1930s, it was standing on a new foundation. The league was now a real business, a structured competition, and a cultural phenomenon waiting to explode. The road to respectability had been hard and often bloody, but it was essential. Without these turning points, the NFL might never have survived long enough to capture America's heart. And that brings us to the final stage of this outlaw to icon journey. In the early days, the National Football League was a wild experiment, a collection of rough men, rougher towns, and rules that seemed more like guidelines than laws. From brawlers throwing punches mid-game to bootleggers funding teams with dirty money, the league looked more like a chaotic tavern than a professional business. Yet somehow, out of that storm of disorder, corruption, and pure grit, something uniquely American was born. This is the story of how the NFL evolved from its outlaw years into the most polished, dominant, and beloved sport in the nation, earning the title of America's game. The transformation was not instant. It happened brick by brick, season by season, as the league outgrew its image as a sideshow of chaos and began shaping itself into a cultural powerhouse. If the 1920s and 30s were the outlaw years, then the decades that followed proved how chaos could forge greatness. Every punch thrown, every shady deal, every muddy game without order helped create a foundation for resilience. The NFL survived because it had no choice. It had to adapt, or it would vanish like so many other leagues of its time. One of the most important shifts was leadership. Figures like George Halas didn't just coach, they envisioned a future where football could rise above the back-alley image of the sport. Halas and others fought for structure, professionalism, and stability. They pushed for standard schedules, better facilities, and consistent rules. Slowly, the sport began to feel less like a gamble and more like a true profession. The players, many of whom had come from the same mills and mines as their fans, were beginning to be recognized as athletes rather than thugs with leather helmets. The media played its role too. At first, newspapers mocked the league for its circus-like atmosphere, highlighting brawls more than touchdowns. But as the NFL matured, journalists began to see the beauty in the game itself, the strategy, the drama, the skill. The gritty image slowly turned into a heroic one. Heroes like Red Grange emerged, men who gave football a face that parents could let their kids admire. When Grange went pro, he wasn't just another athlete, he was a symbol of legitimacy. Crowds followed him, newspapers celebrated him, and sponsors lined up. The outlaw days were still present, but they were now being overshadowed by stars who could elevate the game beyond chaos. Another turning point came with the NFL's ability to connect with the American public's own story. The Great Depression had ravaged the country, leaving families struggling to survive. Football mirrored that toughness. These were men playing for scraps of pay, often working factory jobs on weekdays and strapping on helmets on Sundays. Fans related to them because they lived the same life. The violence on the field wasn't just entertainment, it was a reflection of survival in hard times. Football became less about chaos and more about resilience, courage, and the relentless pursuit of victory. By the time World War II arrived, the NFL had grown beyond its backroom deals and bootlegger ties. Soldiers returning from battle brought with them a craving for the kind of unity, teamwork, and toughness football embodied. The league was no longer a shady spectacle, it was a patriotic pastime. Games honored veterans, halftime ceremonies saluted the troops, and football became woven into the national fabric. The same game that once mirrored bar fights was now seen as the ultimate team effort. The closest thing to a battlefield that fans could witness at home. Television then propelled the NFL into a new era. The violence that once tarnished its image now became part of its appeal. Slow-motion replays of brutal tackles, packed stadiums roaring in unison, and the visual storytelling of broadcasters turned football into must-see drama. Fans who might never set foot in Chicago or Green Bay could now feel connected to their teams from living rooms across the country. The chaos of the outlaw years gave way to polished spectacle, but the DNA of toughness remained. The Super Bowl cemented the transformation. In its early years, the NFL had to fight tooth and nail for survival against rivals like the AFL. That struggle mirrored its outlaw roots: scrappy, underfunded, desperate for respect. But once the leagues merged and the Super Bowl became an annual event, the NFL had not only survived, had triumphed. What began as a chaotic league of brawlers and moonshiners had now produced the single most iconic sporting event in America. Yet even in its polished form, the NFL never lost its outlaw spirit. Fans still loved the hits, the grit, the rawness of the game. The difference was that the league learned how to package it discipline over disorder, controlled aggression over barroom chaos. The NFL didn't erase its outlaw past. It built on it, shaping an identity that combined toughness with spectacle, chaos with order, and violence with strategy. That balance became the heart of America's game. Looking back, the transformation feels almost impossible. How did a league that looked more like a sideshow of moonshiners and street fighters become the most powerful sports league on earth? The answer lies in resilience, vision, and timing. The NFL's outlaw years weren't a flaw, they were a foundation. They tested the league's ability to endure, adapt, and evolve. Out of those smoky backrooms, muddy fields, and fist-swinging games, the NFL forged a culture that would one day dominate Sundays across the nation. Today, when millions tune in to watch the Super Bowl, they are witnessing not just a game, but the result of decades of transformation. From chaos to glory, from bar fights to billion-dollar stadiums. From moonshine-fueled paychecks to superstar contracts, the NFL has traveled a road unlike any other. It is a uniquely American story, one where lawlessness and grit gave way to order and greatness. And so, as we close this journey through the outlaw years, one truth stands clear. The NFL did not escape its wild past, it embraced it, learned from it, and turned it into strength. The bootleggers, the brawlers, the chaos, they all played a role in shaping a league that would rise above it all. That is why the NFL is not just a sport. It is a story of transformation, resilience, and glory. From its outlaw roots to its modern dominance, the league's journey is nothing short of legendary. Because in the end, America did not just fall in love with football. It fell in love with the story of football, the fight to rise, the struggle to survive, and the triumph of turning chaos into glory. Looking back on the outlaw years of the NFL, it becomes clear that this was more than just a messy chapter in sports history. It was the chaotic, unpredictable foundation of what would later become the most powerful and polished sports league in the United States. The league we know today, worth billions of dollars, filled with pristine stadiums, corporate sponsorships, and worldwide influence, was born out of an era when football fields looked more like back alleys than cathedrals of athleticism. To fully appreciate the polished product fans see now every Sunday, you must first understand the grit, the grime, and the lawless energy that defined the game's earliest years. The Prohibition connection and the role of bootleggers remain one of the most fascinating aspects of this story. In a time when alcohol was outlawed, but demand for it was stronger than ever, many of the men who financed early teams and promoted early leagues had ties to moonshine operations and underground networks. They saw football not just as entertainment, but as a way to legitimize money, attract crowds, and even create cover for more questionable activities. When fans walked into a stadium in the 1920s, they weren't just entering a sports venue, they were stepping into a slice of American underworld culture. The roar of the crowd, mixed with the smell of whiskey, cigars, and the unspoken presence of organized crime. It was wild, but it was also uniquely American. And then there were the players themselves. This was not the era of million-dollar contracts, endorsement deals, and carefully sculpted physiques. These were rough men, often fresh from jobs in the mines, the steel mills, or even the back rooms of speakeasies. Many of them treated football as just another fight for survival, another way to prove toughness, and maybe scrape together enough money to keep the lights on at home. On the field, fists often spoke louder than flags. Rivalries weren't confined to the scoreboard. They spilled over into brawls that could break out at any moment. Broken noses, black eyes, and even players swinging at each other with helmets were part of the culture. In many ways, the league's credibility rested on this violence. It was part of the appeal. Fans wanted blood, and they got it. The fans, too, played their part in shaping the outlaw identity of early football. These were not the polite, ticket-buying crowds we associate with modern NFL Sundays. Early games drew in coal miners, factory workers, dockhands, and everyday people who wanted something raw, something real. They stood shoulder to shoulder on muddy sidelines, often spilling onto the field, sometimes even getting into scuffles with players themselves. The line between spectator and participant blurred. For these fans, football was not a packaged product. It was a shared chaos, a community outlet for frustration and pride. In many ways, the audience's rowdy energy mirrored the larger American culture of the time: restless, rebellious, and ready for a fight. Behind the scenes, mobsters and shady businessmen pulled strings, financing teams and cutting deals that often blurred the line between sport and survival. When we talk about the NFL being gritty in its early years, this is what we mean. This was a league that owed as much to smoky back rooms and whispered negotiations as it did to touchdowns and goal lines. Every paycheck a player collected came with uncertainty. Would the money even clear? Would the team still exist next week? This instability, combined with the looming shadow of organized crime, made the NFL as much a gamble as a game. Yet without those risks, without those rough foundations, the league may never have survived long enough to become what it is today. What makes the Outlaw years so compelling is that they show us a version of football completely unrecognizable from today's polished product. And yet, the DNA of the modern NFL is right there in the chaos. The toughness, the physicality, the larger-than-life personalities, those things were forged in an era when rules were loose. Fists were flying, and games often felt like battles for survival. Every time fans cheer a bone-crushing tackle or admire a player's toughness through injury, they are knowingly or not celebrating. A tradition that goes back to those early days when football was as much about grit as it was about glory. The legends of those years, the bootleggers, the bruisers, the larger-than-life characters who treated every game like a war, deserve to be remembered not just as wild men of the past, but as essential builders of the NFL's foundation. Without them, there would be no billion-dollar stadiums, no primetime TV deals, no Super Bowl Sundays that stopped the world in its tracks. Their chaos created the soil in which today's game was planted. In a way, the NFL's clean, corporate image owes everything to the messy lawlessness of its early decades. What once looked like disorder was actually the crucible of innovation and survival. For fans today, these outlaw years are a reminder of why football feels so deeply American. The NFL's past reflects the nation's own journey. Rough, violent, often unfair, but driven by resilience, passion, and the belief that something bigger was always possible. Just as America thrived through Prohibition, Depression, and World Wars, football clawed its way out of chaos into legitimacy. The journey from muddy fields and barroom brawls to billion-dollar franchises mirrors the American spirit of turning struggle into triumph. As we close this exploration of football's outlaw era, one truth stands out above all. The NFL has always been about more than a game. It has been about identity, about toughness, about proving something not just to opponents, but to life itself. The Outlaws, the Brawlers, the Bootleggers, and the Fighters all played their part in shaping that truth. Their chaos became our tradition. Their lawlessness gave birth to order. Their fists paved the way for the bright lights of Sunday Night Football. So, the next time you watch an NFL game, remember this. Beneath the polished turf, the crisp uniforms, and the perfect TV production lies a history that was anything but clean. It was messy, it was violent, it was outrageous, and it was necessary. Because without the outlaw years, there would be no NFL as we know it. The league was built by men who didn't just play football. They survived it, fought through it, and in doing so, gave future generations a game worth believing in. The NFL's outlaw years may be long gone, but their legacy is alive in every hard hit, every roar of the crowd, and every reminder that football at its core is not just about strategy or spectacle. It's about the unbreakable spirit of the game itself. And that spirit was born when bootleggers, brawlers, and dreamers ran the league.